Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Obito Sensei in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Obito Sensei Chapter 14.5 Akatsuki. I think I'd have to start near the beginning, or else I'll sound a little strange. A megakure isn't just a village anymore. It's a nation now, the nation of rain. Your sensei told you that? That's good. Yes, the daimyo was overthrown. Rain's government and the leadership of a megakure became one and the same. It is unusual, everyone thought so. You'd never dream of replacing the daimyo, I imagine. That's because your daimyo has served you well. The daimyo isn't elected, is the Hokage? I'd heard that somewhere. Ah, how interesting. The village must be truly unified, to trust its leadership to democracy like that. The daimyo isn't elected, but he is still in a way your servant, in the same way anyone who is held at the mercy of others is their servant. I'm sorry, perhaps that's a bit harsh. What I'm trying to say, the daimyo of the Land of Fire has worked together well with Konohagakure and the rest of his country. He's done his best to keep the people of the country as safe, happy, and wealthy as possible. The village is a big part of that, naturally. Hidden villages are enormous parts of their country's economies, I'm sure you know that. The daimyo of the Land of Rain wasn't like that. Did you know that during the last 3 great wars, rain was a central battlefield in every one? I know, it's surprising, but when you look at a map, it makes sense. It's set directly between fire and earth, like most of the minor nations and villages. I'm not sure if it's on purpose or not, but it's no accident that that's the case for all the major nations. They're all separated from their neighbors by buffers like the Land of Rain. Yes, there's quite a grudge between Stone and the Leaf. I was surprised to see it today. I'd heard about it, but seeing that hatred for myself, it made me sad. Naruto's father did terrible things to them, I'm sure, but it was a war. The goal is to do terrible things to one another, after all. Still, how many lives do you think he ended, to grow that kind of hatred in children who never met him? It's frightening. Naruto doesn't seem like him, he doesn't seem like what I would expect from the son of a Kage. I guess I don't have a reference. You're right. I guess it is that simple. He's kind. It's an admirable trait. Sasuke seems similar. Where was I? Right. The daimyo of Rain wasn't like yours. He did nothing to protect his people. Maybe you're right, and he just couldn't. Time after time, for decades, Rain was ravaged by armies that had no business with it, only with each other. That was what started the Akatsuki. Oh, so you know the founders? Yes, Konan, Nagato, and Yahiko, Kage. They were trained by a shinobi from the Leaf, who gave them the power to achieve peace. He left, and they took over the village hidden in the rain some time later. But to their surprise, that didn't fix the problem. The previous ruler of a megakure had been a cruel man, that Hanzo the Salamander. The Akatsuki had assumed that removing him would end the conflicts inside their border, that they would be able to keep Rain safe from a megakure, but nothing changed. Eventually, they determined it was the fault of the government of Rain. It was weak, and could not keep other ninja from entering its lands and killing its people. So for the good of Rain, they imprisoned the daimyo. Killing him would be cruel. He lives a comfortable life, but he no longer has any control over it. It makes some sense, doesn't it? I thought so. I made the same face you are when I heard this story for the first time. It seemed silly to say the country's strife was caused by its government, when the other villages were. Yes, Konoha included. No. No, I don't think so. It would be silly of me to say something like that. It's the rational decision for a village to do its best to conduct its wars outside of its home country. Doing otherwise makes them look weak, and risks harming fellow citizens of Fire. Konoha isn't to blame for fighting in Rain, the circumstances that brought it there are. The circumstances? That's a complicated question. I'm too young to answer that in full, unfortunately. I guess I would call it, the world. The system. The shinobi system, you're right. That's a good name for it. You cut right to the heart of it. The shinobi system, then. Have you ever thought about what exactly your job is, Sakura? Maybe that's a rude question. We can stop if you'd like. I overstepped. You're sure? Alright, my apologies. Helping people is a good answer. Maybe it's what shinobi should be. If that's the kind of shinobi you want to be, you should strive for it with all your strength. But I think what most shinobi are trained for isn't that noble. Even me, talking about it now, at its core, everything is driven by supply and demand. That's how things have always worked. The people who succeed are the people who provide something that other people need, or think they need. The thing that shinobi supply is violence, yes. Again, you got right to the heart. You can see I'm struggling, I couldn't have put it that simply. The thing that shinobi supply is violence. Even when we help people, that's almost always how we help them. By putting violence somewhere necessary. Your first C rank? That's a good example, yes. You and your team helped those merchants by killing their captor. How frightening. It's no wonder you picked up a sword after that. That was something only a shinobi could have done. No one else would have stood a chance. Now, how can I say this? The relationship between the shinobi and the daimyo is two sides of the same coin. Shinobi provide violence, but not all of it, because the daimyo need to hold on to some of their own to maintain their independence. That's why all of them have armies, militias, and elite shinobi guards. The daimyo provide stability, but not all of it, because the health of their nation is tied very closely to the prosperity of the hidden villages. In that way, it's a kind of symbiosis. The two sides make each other stronger, and both prosper. Ha! Exactly. That's why we're always taught to work together. Teamwork makes everything stronger. But when one side of that relationship isn't holding up its contract, as it were, the whole thing grows rotten. That's what happened in Rain. The partnership broke down and failed to provide the country with any security or stability. The shinobi, and innocent civilians, were taking on all of the violence with none of the promised benefits. They were just being ground down. That's why the Akatsuki removed him. But those circumstances weren't unique. They could easily be repeated. Well, maybe I'm being cynical, but the only service shinobi can offer is violence, or the threat of violence. That means any system that is centered around ninja, like our current one, operates entirely on an exchange of violence. It's an economy of violence, even if money and pride are the motivators. But the problem with such a system, the shinobi system, as you put it, is that no one wants to be the ones receiving violence. They only want to give it to others. I mentioned earlier that Konoha was correct to fight its wars outside its borders. The same goes for all of the major villages. Fighting in your own country means risking your countrymen, and damaging your village's reputation. Most of the great wars were fought in those minor border countries like Rain. The land of rivers, grass, tea, whirlpools, they all became battlegrounds time and time again, just like Rain. No other country has had something like the Akatsuki, but that's probably because it took several truly incredible shinobi in the right place at the right time to make it happen. This happens because, like we've been saying, violence has to be exported. No, you wouldn't want to find it at the store. It's something that the villages can only give to other countries, or else they'll seem to be failing. I was born in the land of water, yes, I'm like Kabuto. I lost my parents when I was young. Water is a larger country, but it was trampled in the Second War and many of its citizens grew to loathe and fear shinobi. Despite that, one saved me and took me away. His name was Zabuza. Yes, he's in the land of Rain now as well. He went there looking for vengeance, maybe. Money, mostly. But he found something else, so we stayed there. It was a strange relationship. But he saved my life, and taught me how to survive. I'll always be grateful to him, even if, well, I won't bore you with that. The point is, shinobi travel to other countries, spread violence, and create instability. My, it sounds so horrible when I put it that way. That instability is supposed to be countered by the daimyo, but in some cases it grows beyond their control. When that happens, people look for other solutions. Some flee the country entirely. Most of the time, the minor villages and countries throw themselves into service to the major powers, hoping for protection. That wasn't something Rain ever did, perhaps Hanzo was too proud for it. Is that so? I wouldn't be surprised. It seems in his character. Well, most villages aren't like Rain. The land of rivers, for example, they've been Konoha's allies since the Second War. They were kept from being trampled in the Third. That's the power of the 5 villages. Right now, countries like them are relatively safe. But Rain, and perhaps Frost. They're stuck between the Leaf, Stone, and Cloud. All powerful villages, all with deep grudges. If another war ever starts, they'll be the battlegrounds, I'm sure. No. I hope not. I pray not. I don't ever want to see a war. That's why I joined the Akatsuki at all. I've been babbling. At its heart, all Akatsuki wants is to prevent war. To keep peace. Thank you. I appreciate that. What do you mean by a contradiction? Well, I suppose that's correct. The daimyo want the villages to be as strong as possible, but not so strong they grow out of control. That would upset the contract between them, if the village could provide all the necessary violence and stability for the country, as a megakuer can. Oh, without a doubt. It's a delicate balance. I don't want to sound rude, but the Land of Fire isn't the most powerful nation in the world because it grows the most food, or produces the most goods. It's because it can export the most violence. Or nowadays, the most threat of violence. Because Konoha is in such a strong position. I know, but that's what being shinobi is. Your Hokage is the only living ninja marked as flea on sight, you must know that. That definition alone is all you need. Konoha is the mightiest because it is the most frightening. I'm not trying to. I'm right? I thought you'd be. Okay. If you say so. Do you want to? Why do you think there are only 5 great villages, Sakura? It's not just because it's a convenient number. Each of the countries grew with their villages, absorbing more territory as their shinobi grew stronger. The Land of Fire is so large because Konoha has been so strong for so long. The same goes for lightning, mist, and earth. Only wind has remained mostly the same, and that's probably because of its deserts. No one else is confident enough to live there. Yes, I'm worried about that sand team as well. I can't picture them working with others. That boy from Stone mentioned them. I wonder what he meant by nabbed. I suppose we'll find out tomorrow for sure. What I'm trying to say is that the 5 villages, on purpose, or not, won't allow anyone to rise to challenge them. I don't mean that in a menacing way. I'm just saying that they have a monopoly on their violence, and there's only so much to go around. There have been other villages like Rain, in the past. Not the Akatsuki, I mean. Minor villages that grew strong enough to gain acknowledgement from the others. We're growing every year, I'm sure we've been mentioned. Well, I guess that's gratifying in a way. But it's also what I'm talking about. The last was Uzashiagakur, the village hidden in the whirlpools. It was ruled by the Uzumaki, but they grew too strong for their neighbors' liking. Before they were destroyed, they were between water and lightning, the 2 villages allied to decimate them. That was the end of the Second Ninja War. Konoha was their ally, but there was nothing they could do, fighting stone and sand at the same time. Yes, it must have been terrible. There weren't many surviving Uzumaki, but they fled across the world, many of them to Konoha. Perhaps you've met some of them. No? That's surprising. Well, maybe now that you know of them you'll notice them. I don't think things can continue. I've talked about this with people before, but you've made me think about it more, I guess. The whole system, it's evil. It exploits and destroys people. There has to be a better way, right? Right now, maybe it's because it's so dark. This forest really is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Trees like these. I feel like we're moving steadily towards something horrible. Each war has been more terrible than the last. Shinobi are only growing stronger and more numerous. Any system like this naturally creates tension. People and nations grind together, competing constantly. Maybe that's what the daimyo want. For us all to come together in one last great clash and destroy each other. To reset the board to when they didn't have to worry about balancing the villages and their countries, to keep shinobi in the thrall of unworthy people forever. You're right, that's paranoid. I shouldn't say it like that. It's not that they're consciously creating the situation. It's just how it is. Like gravity. Like any competitive economy. The violence just grows and grows. I'm sorry. I'm tired. I didn't mean to be so melodramatic. What am I devoted to? I never did give a straight answer, did I? To peace, I guess. I said that at least. To creating a world where no one will desire war. I just want people to be safe. To not feel like they have to fight and kill to get what they want. Maybe that's naive, but I think so long as I hold to that goal, we'll be able to accomplish something. Exactly. Better to try than to concede. That's what Zabuza always told me. That you only lose when you give up. When he was training me he taught me that shinobi were tools, but Rain showed me that was a lie. A lie I think he told himself, to keep himself, not happy, but sane. Shinobi are people that sometimes make tools of themselves. That's what I try to keep in my heart. I refuse to be a tool. Thanks for talking with me. I haven't. It's nice, sometimes. You're smart, Sakura. Maybe you could look at all this and come up with a better answer than me. I'm just going to keep the people precious to me safe, and follow the Omekage wherever he leads me. That's all I think I can do. We should get the next shift, yeah. Naruto and Kabuto, I think. Let's give Suijutsu and Sasuke more time to rest, they took both those stone ninja down, after all. Good idea. My secret? You really want to know? Oh, I'm a boy. Good night. Obito Sensei Chapter 15. What comes first? When they set out at dawn, Sakura's head was buzzing with half-remembered words and hardly formed ideas. Her conversation with Haku the night before hadn't been long, maybe 20 minutes at the very most, but she'd never experienced something like it. The boy, how was he a boy? It wasn't fair, was probably a little crazy, she thought. Everyone in Rain might have been, if they were led by people who believed the kind of things Haku did. Nevertheless, for the first time in her life Sakura had stepped back. Not just from herself, which had happened several times now, but from her team, from being a ninja, from living in Konoha, from everything that her life had been built on, and looked over it with new eyes. Haku might have been a little crazy, but she couldn't tell him anything he'd said was wrong. He might have been lying, but everything he'd said had sounded correct, hit a chord of truth on a deep level inside her. It had reached down and taken her dissatisfaction, her uncertainty, and her fear and given a shape and a name to all of it. The shinobi system. You live in a world ruled by an economy of violence, Sakura. Why wouldn't you be afraid? You alright? Naruto asked her, and Sakura blinked and shook her head, trying to get her thoughts straight. She looked over at her teammate, who was watching her with a friendly grin as usual. Did Naruto think about the kind of things Haku had talked about, smaller villages being crushed by the tension between the larger ones, how many people his father had killed to bring Konoha peace and safety, even though he was the closest one to it of any of them? Sakura doubted it. If he did, could he possibly smile like that? I'm fine, Naruto. She smiled at him. It had felt like she was being carried away in a flurry of exhaustion for a moment, but Naruto had grounded her. She'd barely slept. The forest was loud and dark, and her mind louder and darker. Thanks for asking. Course, Naruto said, looking back. He and Sakura were at the front of the group, the team from Rain and Sasuke were following behind them. They'd been moving through the forest for some time now, silently rushing from tree to tree in a blur of green and gray, and the sun was finally making its way into the sky. So, Haku's really a boy, huh? I know, Sakura acknowledged. I couldn't believe it either when he told me. I definitely didn't see that coming, Naruto laughed. I mean, he's the way he dresses. He flushed and struggled for the words as Sakura watched, trying not to laugh at her teammate's embarrassment. Well, you know. Yeah, Sakura said, looking back at Haku. The ninja from Rain caught her eye and nodded, and she wondered what he was thinking. The same things as her? No, probably not. What Haku had told her was just normal for him. He wouldn't think so much about it, the same way Sakura had never thought about why Konoha was so much stronger than the other villages. He's a little strange. They had to be getting close to the center of the forest now. Sakura was glad they'd stopped for the night, even if she had barely been able to sleep. The training ground was quiet now, and the morning sun was bright and warm even through the thick canopy. It made her feel more confident. "I see it," Suzuki said from somewhere behind them. Sakura strained to peer through the canopy, and realized her teammate was right. It was almost hidden behind all the trees and leaves, but less than half a mile away, the tower was coming into sight. It was enormous and dull red, like a spike stuck into the middle of the forest. "We have to be extra careful here," Kabuto said, drawing up alongside Sakura and Naruto. "If I was on a team that didn't have a scroll, I'd be waiting at the tower for teams that did. This will probably be the trickiest part." He was right, Sakura thought as they drew closer to the tower. If there were any teams waiting for them here, they'd be the most desperate. The tower grew larger and larger, and Sakura steeled herself, her hand resting on her sword. But nothing happened. No attack came. There was a clearing around the tower, about 100 meters of carefully maintained grass and a moat, and both teams reached it without incident, jumping into the high branches around it and looking around suspiciously, waiting for an ambush, an angry yell, something. There wasn't a sound. The clearing was empty, and there was no one to greet Team 7 or their allies. It still felt like they were being watched. "I don't get it," Naruto said. "We can't be the only ones who made it." "Maybe," Suijutsu said, looking around. "But I sure as hell don't see anyone. If someone's waiting to ambush us, they're being super sneaky about it." "I don't see anyone either," Suzuki confirmed, his red eyes whirling and scanning the whole clearing. He was crouched low on his branch, one hand touched down to the tree. He was obviously ready to leap into action at the slightest sign of movement. How could that be possible? Sakura's hand tightened around her sword. They couldn't be the first ones arriving. Where were the other teams? "We just have to enter the tower," Haku said calmly, pointing to a set of double doors set in the building, the closest entrance to them. "Whether we're attacked or not won't matter, so long as we make it inside." "You're right." Sakura surprised herself by stepping forward, unsheathing her sword. "Let's just go. Right now. If we're being watched, we shouldn't give them any more time." "Good idea," Suzuki said, standing up. "I'll lead." He leapt off the tree and sped towards the tower, tearing a path through the grass, and Sakura and Naruto followed a heartbeat later. The team from Rain was right behind them, all 6 of them forming a blinding fast spear thrown directly at the center of the tower. Sakura held her sword low at her side as they ran, expecting another attack at any moment, maybe even from the stone team once more. But again, nothing happened. They crossed the final 100 meters to the tower in less than 4 seconds, the short time stretched out to something grotesque by the tension rippling through Sakura's body. Suzuki reached the door, the first of them, and tore it open. The 5 of them flung themselves past it, inside the tower. Sakura skidded to a stop and turned, waiting for Suzuki to follow. The door was still open. Suzuki was standing there, half visible. But he wasn't moving. "Suzuki!" Naruto hissed, scrambling to his feet. "Close the door." Her teammate was staring at something, stock still. Sakura looked past him, her heart loud in her ears, and saw what had pinned him in place. There was a man watching them from the branches they'd leapt from. Tall, with dark hair. His eyes were red. He gave them a casual wave, and Suzuki flinched. He was following. Suzuki's voice was low and dark, his hand curled into a fist. "I was right. Suzuki." Sakura heard her voice tremble, and she hated the sound of it. "Please dash." "Close the door," Naruto demanded. He stomped forward, seizing Suzuki's shoulders and glaring up at their pursuer. "Right now." He spun his teammate back, and Suzuki slammed the door shut behind him, his whole body shaking in rage. "What dash?" Haku started to ask, before Suzuki stormed past him. The Uchiha was gritting his teeth. "Let's go." "Who was that?" Kabuto asked. "There was a man out there." "It's Dash." Suzuki snapped, before taking a deep breath. He closed his eyes, fists unclenching. It's nothing. It's another ninja, Haku said. It can't be nothing. Sasuke could be difficult to read, but Sakura could tell he was about to say something stupid. Naruto started to say something, but she was quicker than him. He was following us, she cut in, stepping forward and meeting Sasuke's glance. He pursed his lips and nodded, the motion so small only someone who was looking for it could have seen it. We weren't sure of it until just now, but we suspected. He was the one who broke Sasuke's arm. He had the same kind of eyes, Suijutsu said, a little subdued. At least, the most subdued Sakura had heard him. Another Uchiha. Yeah, Sasuke said brusquely. It's my business. He shook his head. Let's just finish this stupid test. He's not going to come after us? Haku asked. He followed us all this way, he'll just wait outside. Who knows? How could Sasuke possibly be feeling, Sakura wondered, with his brother just outside? Sakura couldn't wrap her head around it, but it was obvious that her teammates were both paralyzed. Itaka could trivially kill them all, that much was evident from their first encounter, but he'd been content to follow them. If they turned and attacked, they'd just get beaten again. They were totally at his mercy. Naruto, she murmured, drawing closer to him. We need to find someone. We need to tell someone. There must be some proctors here. Naruto hummed in agreement, turning around and surveying the room the door had led to. It was a long hall, with balconies running high up alongside either wall. At the end of the hall, there were sentences emblazoned on the walls in huge bright font. Huh, Naruto said, looking up at the kanji. If you lack heaven, seek wisdom, and prepare yourself. If you lack earth, seek strength, and better yourself. He scratched his chin. These words will guide a person's extremes. Those are the words of the third Hokage. All of them, Leaf and Rain alike, spun towards the sudden voice in surprise. There was a ninja up on the balcony to their left, she'd appeared silently and from nowhere. Sakura blinked. The woman had brown eyes and purple hair, and was wearing a thick brown coat, with a scarf wrapped around her neck. It wasn't that cold outside, why was she that bundled up? The shinobi leapt down off the balcony, landing without a sound before them. He passed them along to us, so we could dash, she started to say, before Sasuke cut her off. Itaki Uchiha is outside, he said, and the woman froze. What? She asked, her voice sudden and sharp, and Sasuke nodded. He attacked me at the beginning of the exam, and followed us through the forest, he said. He watched us enter the tower. He hasn't come after us yet. The woman cursed, so viciously that Sakura almost flinched, and turned her back on them, disappearing deeper into the tower. Both teams glanced at each other, not sure what to say next. Does that mean we pass? Suijutsu asked, and Naruto shrugged. Probably, he said, sitting down with his legs crossed under him. I hope so. Let's just wait. I don't want to get disqualified on accident. That was a pretty good idea, Sakura thought, and she sat down next to Naruto to show her agreement. She wasn't tired anymore, now, it was like her whole body was an electrical current. They'd made it to the tower. Whether it was Sasuke's brother, the other teams, or something else entirely, they had to be ready for whatever came next. ####. Team 7 and the team from Rain waited for 20 minutes before someone found them. It wasn't a proctor. Sakura. Sakura's head jerked up at the voice, and she found Tenten beaming at her down from the same balcony the proctor had watched them from. You guys passed. Tenten. Sakura pulled herself to her feet. Sasuke was chatting with Suijutsu and Kabuto, and Naruto was playing some kind of game with Haku that involved holding his hands out and trying not to get them slapped. So far, he'd lost every time, but that just made him more determined. They all watched her get up. The Rain Ninja looked at Tenten with some interest, and she looked back at them, obviously confused. Rain? She asked. Huh? Where's everyone else? Sakura asked, and Tenten leaned against the railing, smiling down at her. Niji and Lee are sparring, I got bored and came to see if anyone else had made it, she said, cocking her head. Why are they here too? She asked, motioning at the rain shinobi. We decided to team up, Haku said, and Tenten's eyebrow shot up in surprise. Team up? She said, and Sakura nodded, a little confused. Of course, she said. That's what the examiner said, right? That you couldn't present two scrolls by themselves. You had to work with another team to present them both at once. Tenten blinked. Huh, she said again. Sakura could tell she couldn't decide whether to be amused or impressed. We didn't think of that. What do ya mean? Naruto asked, before yelping as Haku slapped his hands again. Haku giggled, sounding just as feminine as he looked. How'd you pass then? We presented 3, Tenten said, and Sasuke grunted. He was still moody, understandably so, Sakura thought. She was impressed he was even talking to anyone, let alone the Rain Ninja. They took that? He asked, and Tenten laughed. Yeah, she said. Of course they did. That's what Choza said, right? Sakura felt her stomach sink at her friend's words. She looked around at her team and her new friends. She'd misinterpreted the rules, and so had the team from Rain. Sakura had assumed everyone in the staging area had been looking at one another in search of allies, but she saw now that she'd been projecting. They'd been sizing up the competition. Only Haku and his teammates had come to the same conclusion as her. Would they even still pass? So, you took 3? Kabuto asked, and Tenten nodded. From other villages, I assume. Who else made it? Tenten's face grew a little more serious, and she jumped down off the balcony, landing in front of Sakura. Only one other, she said, and Sakura jerked back in surprise. She heard Sasuke mutter something under his breath. Which one? Haku asked, and Tenten regarded him cautiously. Haku wasn't her friend, Sakura realized. Haku wasn't even Sakura's friend to her. Tenten didn't know about the time they'd spent together. To Tenten, and probably every other ninja in Konoha, Haku was just a suspicious furry ninja from an upstart village with delusions of grandeur. No wonder Tenten was looking at him like that. Wouldn't Sakura have given him the same kind of look, if she were in Tenten's place? The team from Sand, she said, and at Sakura's side, Naruto narrowed his eyes. Gaara of the desert, and his 2 flunkies. They arrived with 5 scrolls. Tenten's face twitched, almost pulling into a sneer before she controlled herself, letting out a frustrated sigh. They hunted down all the other Leaf teams, and everyone else who got in their way. Shit. Naruto started pacing. Shit. Was everyone okay? I dunno, Tenten said, looking and sounding as grim as Sakura had ever seen her. But I'm glad you guys are safe. She stepped forward and clapped her hand down on Sakura's shoulder. You get a chance to use that sword? She asked with a grin, and Sakura nodded. We got attacked by a team from Stone, she said. They were after Naruto. She shook her head. Is that why there was no else at the tower? Everyone else has been disqualified. Pretty much, Tenten confirmed. We got here first, and then the Sand team showed up near the end of the day. She glanced at Naruto. They seemed really confident you'd show up. That freak's got it out for me, Naruto grumbled. We were keeping a low profile, he probably figured I'd pass, and that he could come after me in the next test. Makes sense, Tenten agreed. Well, you'll just have to disappoint him. She frowned. They're still in the building, but they're keeping to themselves for now. I'd stay out of their way. Sounds good to me, Naruto said, a little subdued. Sakura didn't know what to say. She wanted to comfort him, but what could she say? She'd seen the glint of madness in Gaara's eyes as he'd told Naruto they were both sons of Yondaime, that meant he was destined to kill her teammate. In the face of that reality, what could her words do? Don't worry about it, Sasuke said, saying what Sakura couldn't. You can take that freak. He took out at least 5 other teams, Naruto pointed out. All of our classmates, and probably a ton of other people if no other teams made it to the tower. He's gotta be something crazy, to manage that. Or maybe it was his teammates, Sakura pointed out, and Naruto marginally relaxed. Sasuke's right, You shouldn't worry about that right now. Yeah, Naruto said, still not sounding entirely sure. I guess. They stayed like that for a moment, pondering the surreality of the situation. Is there anyone else in the tower? Sasuke eventually asked, and Tenten shook her head. Nah, she said, turning and starting to walk away. She looked over her shoulder expectantly, and both Team 7 and the team from Rain started following. There were a couple proctors, but they all left about 20 minutes ago. No doubt thanks to your spooky friend, Suijutsu laughed, and Tenten looked back curiously as she led them through a maze of halls and stairs. Friend? She asked, and Sasuke closed his eyes. A rogue ninja, he said, and Tenten's face just grew more curious. He attacked me, and followed us through the forest. A rogue ninja? Tenten asked, sounding a little excited. Why'd he follow you guys? Her gaze shifted to Naruto. That was the obvious reason. It doesn't matter, Sasuke said, and Tenten gave him a dubious look. Well, I guess that explains where everyone went, she said, turning a final corner and opening a double door. As she stepped through, there was a loud thwack. Sakura peered past her friend. The room was a small dojo, and Rock Lee was laid out on the ground, rolling back and forth and clutching at his face. Oh, Tenten. Niji looked up, shaking his hand out. Lee stopped rolling and peered up at them between two fingers, before springing to his feet. Ah! He cried, his nose swollen and one of his eyes black. Neither Niji or Lee were ever ones to hold back, Sakura mused, even in a spar. Niji had several nasty bruises himself, mostly on his arms. Punching Lee was a painful proposition, even for the genius Hyuga. Naruto. Sasuke. Sakura. He glanced past them, to the Rain Ninja behind them, and took them in stride. Shinobi of Rain. You made it. Hey Lee. Naruto grinned, stepping around Sakura. She glanced at him, his moodiness had vanished. Even if it was possible they hadn't passed the test, they were safe now. Looks like you're having fun. I lost again. Lee declared. But I'm getting closer. Course you are, Naruto said. He gave Niji a little wave, and the Hyuga returned it with a nod. You guys having fun? A little, Niji said, his eyes narrowing. Though the quality of the rest of the participants was disappointing. It was not difficult to secure our scrolls. Yeah, we heard about that, Naruto said. So you really grabbed 3, huh? Of course, Niji said. What other dash? He titled his head, blank eyes darting from Naruto, to Sasuke, to Sakura, and then to Haku, standing at her side. Ah. That's clever. Do you think it will work? We believed it was the intended solution, Haku said, stepping forward. He extended his hand, and Niji blinked. I'm Haku, of the Rain. Niji glanced down at Haku's hand, and then turned towards Sakura, quirking an eyebrow. After a moment, Haku got the message. He slowly withdrew his hand. He didn't look embarrassed, but Sakura was feeling enough for both of them. You allied with Fur-eaten Shinobi. Niji's eyes were saying. Tenten had shrugged it off, and Lee had barely noticed, but their teammate wasn't the same way. Maybe because he was a Hyuga, or maybe because he was Niji, competitive, powerful, and uncompromising. Whatever the reason, Niji was looking at her, the one who'd been standing most comfortably with Haku, and his blank eyes were full of something between judgment and amusement. Interesting, Niji said. Well, I hope it works out for you. It would be dull for the only other team to pass to be from Sand. Are they around? Naruto asked. You know. He tapped his temple, and Niji nodded and activated his Byakugan. They're here, he confirmed. But they're keeping to themselves. Naruto sighed. That's what Tenten said, he said, and the girl grinned at him. I guess. You're frightened? Lee asked, and Naruto jerked, looking at him. Sakura had wandered over to the corner of the training room, and she sat down, watching her teammate. Why? I'm not Dash. Naruto started to declare, before deflating. Yeah, I'm scared. He frowned. Right before the second test started, He told me it was his destiny to kill me, or something. 'Cause both our dad were Kage. He really believed it too. It was creepy. Extremely, Sasuke confirmed. Also interesting, Neji said with a blank smile, and Naruto raised an eyebrow. Perhaps he'd be a good opponent for me then. Ha, Naruto said, not nearly as enthusiastic as he should have been. Yeah, that'd be nice. Maybe you could kick his ass like you have ours. That'd be great. If the opportunity arises, Neji said. I'll make it happen. Without a doubt. Neji, Guy Sensei would be proud. Lee declared, and Neji rolled his eyes at him. Defending an ally, and seeking out a powerful foe. That's the core of being a shinobi. I don't know about that, Tenten said. Hasn't the Hokage always said that being a shinobi is about sacrifice? What a shinobi is isn't something everyone agrees on, Kabuto spoke up from the corner, and the room turned to look at him. It's not a universal concept. Sacrifice, money, justice, peace. Everyone has their own reason. He smiled at Lee, who grinned back at the older boy. But your sensei certainly sounds like a good one. Of course. Lee declared. He's the strongest in the leaf. Naruto laughed. Not stronger than my dad. He stretched as Lee pouted, cracking something in his elbow. Is there anything to eat around here or something? I'm starving. There's a dining hall downstairs, Neji said, slipping his shoes on. Both he and Lee had been barefoot during their spar. Come. I could eat as well. ####. The rain team stuck by their side throughout breakfast, and afterwards as well. The reason was simple, neither of them wanted to be separated from the other's scroll, and risk failing. They were good company as well, but after the way Neji had looked at her, Sakura tried not to think about that as much. 2 hours after they'd arrived at the tower, the proctor that had greeted them returned. She stumbled into the room, looking irritated, and tugged down her scarf to scowl at them. What happened? Sasuke shot to his feet, and the woman rolled her eyes. Nothing, she said, walking over to them and putting her hands on her hips as she looked back and forth between the two teams. Just a wild goose chase. He was there, Sakura insisted, and the woman nodded. He was there, she agreed. All the censors say so, though no one knows how he got in the first place. She sighed. Forget about that for now. So, what, you guys looking to pass? Sasuke and Suijutsu glanced at each other, and both nodded. At the same time, they reached into their pouches and removed their respective scrolls, heaven and earth. Huh, the proctor said, looking back and forth between the scrolls and the teams. That's clever. So, do we pass? Naruto asked with a grin, and the woman grinned back at him. Yeah, you pass, she said, and Naruto cheered. He gave Sasuke a high five, who received it lackadaisically, and turned and hugged Sakura, squeezing her and almost picking her up off the ground. She yelped in surprise, and he yelped as well, practically dropping her. Sorry. He said as the proctor and the team from Rain laughed. His face was as red as a tomato. Sorry. It's okay, Sakura said, catching her breath. She hadn't expected that, but it hadn't been bad. Just surprising. I didn't think you'd get that excited, Naruto. He rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. Yeah. I guess when I heard about the other teams, I wasn't sure if we'd pass. I was feeling really stupid. He turned back to the proctor. But we did it. Sure did, the woman said, sounding both tired and bored. Toss me the scrolls, would you? Sasuke and Suijutsu obliged, and the proctor snatched both out of the air, tucking them behind her back. Okay, sit tight, she said. There was gonna be a third test, but with only 4 teams passing, we're probably gonna have to skip it. Someone will be along for you guys. She left the room, and both teams settled back down, satisfied. We made a good choice, Suijutsu said with a smirk. You guys did too. So there won't be a third test? Naruto asked, and Sasuke nodded thoughtfully. Does that mean we just win? We're Chunin. It's unlikely, Haku said with a soft smile. The Chunin exam is an opportunity for the villages to show off their strength to the countries of the world. There will probably be another test, yes. All of them spun in alarm at the voice, and Sakura felt her stomach drop. Naruto's father, the fourth Hokage, was sitting next to his son, legs crossed beneath him, his long white coat flowing out behind him. He'd appeared from nowhere. The yondaime had a serious look on his face, but he was calm and still. Naruto jerked away in surprise, but he was smiling. Maybe he was used to his father suddenly showing up. Is that? Kabuto asked, and Haku bowed. Lord Hokage, he said, and his teammates followed suit, even Suijutsu. You honor us with your presence. So polite, like he always was. But wasn't that you had to be, Sakura thought, in the presence of a man like Naruto's father? Haku of the Akatsuki, the yondaime said with a coy smile, and Haku flinched. The Hokage knew his name. Sakura realized it wasn't that shocking after a moment of thought. They'd been in the tower for some time, and all the applicants were registered by the village. But it was still a surprise to hear the boy's name come from the Hokage's mouth. It seems I may have to thank you and your team. He glanced at Naruto. You helped my son where others could not. What happened to the others? Naruto asked, and glanced at Sasuke. And one moment, the Hokage said, standing up. He seemed to tower over them, even though the difference in height was not that extreme. He just had an enormous and commanding presence. Like I said, I am grateful for you and your team, he said, watching Haku with sharp blue eyes. Sakura couldn't read him at all. But I have to discuss private business with my shinobi. Of course, Haku said, bowing again. We'll leave you the room. He turned to leave, looking over his shoulder with a smile. See you. He directed the comment at all of them, but he was looking at Sakura as he said it, and she felt something burn between them. Sasuke was looking at her funny, and she shook off the feeling. The rest of the rain team said their goodbyes and left the room, Kabuto bringing up the rear and gently closing the door. The Hokage waited for a moment, watching the door and crossing his arms, before turning to them. You had an eventful day, he said, and Naruto laughed. Obito was quite angry with me. Sensei was angry, Lord Hokage. Sakura asked, and the man laughed. Minato is fine, Sakura, he said, and Sakura tried to wrap her head around the fact that the Hokage had just told her to stick to his first name. And yeah. I told him this was going to be a safe exam. He frowned. That turned out to be a lie. Where's Itachi? Sasuke asked, and the Hokage blew out a breath. Gone, he said, and Sasuke flinched. There's traces of his chakra, but no one was able to track him down, not even the Censor Corp. Not even Kushina. We don't think he's still in the village, but it's possible. He held his hand up as Sasuke's questioning look. Your family is safe. He didn't even approach the compound. We can't figure out why he was here. He told us, Naruto said, and his father glanced at him. He said he was checking up on Sasuke. The Hokage looked doubtful, the same way Sakura felt. After what Itachi had done, there was no way he would just check up on his brother. He must have had another motive. Well, regardless, the search is still out for him. Obito is leading it. If anything happens, he'll tell you. Team 7 mulled that over, and the Hokage smiled. I came here for one other reason, he said, and Naruto perked up. I'm very impressed with all of you. Impressed, Lord Hokage? Sakura asked, and Minato grinned. For teaming up with the Rain team, he said. Not only did you guys figure out an unconventional way to pass my test. I was hoping something like that would happen. You were hoping for that? Naruto asked, and the Hokage nodded. The Chunin exam is a time for the villages to come together and compete off the battlefield, he said. But it's always also been a good time to forge alliances, like the one we have with Sand. You three managed to look past that team's village and made allies of them. To you, they were still fellow shinobi. His smile faded a little. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're going to need in the future. If Sand's our ally, Sasuke asked quietly, why did their team hunt down all the other Leaf Ninja? This time, the Hokage's smile vanished completely. None of your friends were killed or crippled, he said with a distasteful look. Despite Gaara's proclivities, his father has him under control. The Kaze cage came with him, to prevent anything too serious from happening. It was Gaara then. Not his teammates. Everyone's okay then? Naruto asked, and his father shook his head. No, he said shortly, and for a second Sakura saw in the Hokage the same enormous anger that she sometimes felt in herself, the anger that had made her swallow the bells, try to crush Haiden's heart, the anger she had felt towards the entire world as she'd try to fall asleep on a wide branch in the dark. In her, it had driven her forward. In the Hokage, someone who could command a whole hidden village, it was something entirely more dangerous. A team from stone is dead. Gaara killed them all. But all of your comrades will recover. He did not disobey his father there, at least. Dead? A team from stone was dead? Sakura felt a cold sweat on her hands, her body growing clammy. Had there been more than one team from stone? Or had those two girls and that boy, had they died, before leaving the forest? Had Sakura and her friends been one of the last people to see them live? Had Gaara killed that scared boy who'd tried to keep his teammates from attacking the Hokage's son? Even though he'd just been trying to leave, had Gaara killed him? Sakura blinked, feeling her heart pounding. Well, I'm glad everyone will be okay, Naruto said, picking up on his father's feelings. He looked a little surprised at the Yondame's harsh tone. He shuffled his feet. What are we doing next, then? We'll be skipping straight to the final. It will be held in a month, the Hokage said. There aren't enough teams to merit the third test, and you've all more than proved yourself regardless. What's the final going to be? Naruto asked, and his father laughed. Now that would be giving you an unfair advantage, he said, and Naruto stuck his tongue out. I just wanted to tell you guys I was impressed by your decision. I'm not gonna give you more than that. Thank you, Minato, Sasuke said quietly, and the Hokage gave him a nod. If you see him before we do, tell Obito Sensei to be careful, please. Attack is only gotten stronger. We couldn't even come close to touching him. Will do, the Hokage said, making the same motion that Sakura had seen their sensei do several times, bumping two pointed fingers off his hitayate in a modified salute. Was that where their sensei had picked it up in the first place? How surreal. Good luck. He vanished without sound or motion, and Team 7 was suddenly alone again. Less than 5 seconds later, before they could adjust to the quiet, the proctor that had greeted them stuck her head back into the room. All done? She asked, and Sakura nodded. Great, we're meeting in the central tournament room. Get on down there. Team 7 dutifully followed the woman, Sakura entranced by her bouncing scarf. The woman glanced back at her as they descended yet another staircase, twisting towards the center of the tower. Hey, you're Kaizashi's daughter, aren't you? She asked, and Sakura tilted her head at the question. Sakura Harano. That's me, she said, and the woman grinned. I thought so, you've got your dad's hair, she said, and Sakura frowned. How do you know my father? She asked, and the woman shrugged. Once again, both of Sakura's parents had been out of the village when the Chunin exam started, but they'd promised they'd stay for the rest if Sakura passed the next couple tests. Even with the money she'd gotten from Haiden's bounty, they still kept taking missions. It was thanks to that Sakura had realized that at heart, both her parents were addicted to work. They took missions constantly, not because they needed the money, but because they preferred being on a mission over anything else. Even spending time with me. He's one of my subordinates, the woman wearing several layers said as they reached the bottom of the stairs. I'm Anko Mitarashi, your dad's ended up under my command a few times. Oh. Sakura said the exclamation out loud as well, and Anko laughed. You're Takubitsu Anko. The one and only, the woman said. Your dad wouldn't stop talking about you the last couple months, you know. He was ecstatic that you picked up a sword, he's got a fascination with them, that's for sure. Her father always had loved his scissor sword, Sakura thought. It was of his own design, even. But he hadn't expressed that same enthusiasm to her, he'd helped her train, and shown a bit of glee as she'd learned more advanced techniques and grown more confident with the blade, but Sakura wouldn't have called him ecstatic. That's nice to hear, she said with a smile, trying not to let what she was thinking show through it. I hope he's been a good subordinate. Always reliable, Anko said with a laugh. If a little hot-headed. They reached the bottom of the tower and came to a set of huge double doors. The woman pushed through them without hesitation. All of the other remaining teams were inside the huge room behind the doors, Tenten's, Haku's, and Gaara's, all standing in lines of 3, dutifully waiting. Anko pointed to a spot in the middle, to Tenten's right and the Sand team's left. Go wait there, she said. It should only be a second. Naruto took the lead, and Sakura fell in behind him, with Sasuke behind her. They trooped up besides Tenten's team, and Lee gave Naruto an enthusiastic wave. Tenten gave Sakura a smile, which she distractedly returned. The team from Sand was about 3 meters to their right. The boy with the wrapped object on his back and the girl with the fan were just looking straight ahead, quiet and still as rocks. But Gaara of the desert was looking left, staring at the front of their line. His eyes were completely fixed on Naruto, unblinking. Naruto resisted the urge to look, but after a second he gave in, glancing back at Sakura and Sasuke and then to the right, at Gaara. Their eyes locked. Sakura felt something pass between them, as sure and solid as a gust of wind or a crackling flame. After a moment, Gaara grinned. Naruto's head snapped back to the front of the room, but Gaara still refused to look away. Sakura suppressed a shiver. Something was wrong with the boy from Sand. It was that simple. He was inhuman. She felt horrible to think about it, but she was glad he was focused on Naruto, and not her. Her teammate could handle it, he was strong, and braver than he thought. If Gaara went after him, Naruto could just blow him up. Sakura was sure of that, after what he'd done to the stone team. The team Gaara had killed. Good morning. Sakura's attention was drawn back to the front of the room. There were suddenly several shinobi there, including Anko. The man speaking was familiar to her. He was the man with spiky black hair and 2 scars that had been in the meeting Naruto had busted into to show off the raised non. I am Shikaku Nara. He grinned humorlessly. I was going to be the proctor of the 3rd test, before you all proved too efficient for your own good. His eyes flickered over to Gaara. Now, I will be the referee of the Chunin exam finals. Nara. Shikamaru's father, Sakura wondered. All the tests so far had been administered by shinobi from the Ino-Shikacho formation, like the one Ino had ended up in. All those clans were pretty prestigious. The Hokage really had been trying to keep things under control, if he'd been putting ninja like that in charge of tests. Shikaku continued speaking, all the other shinobi motionless and silent at his side. There were about a dozen of them, a wall of flak jackets and grim faces. Were they here for them, Sakura thought, or in case Ataki Uchiha came back? She recognized some of them from the first test, including a Hyuga. His Byakugan was active, pushing veins out of his temple. The final will be held 1 month from now, Shikaku said. There, you will be given your final chance to prove yourself worthy of being Chunin. However, unlike the previous tests, you will not be working directly with your team. That made sense. All of the other stages had been testing their teamwork, information gathering, and survival skills. It will be a tournament composed of duels, 1-on-1. There will not be a bracket, you will only have a single fight, so you can put everything into it. Being a shinobi was about violence, first and foremost, Sakura thought. It made perfect sense for the final test to be a singular test of that skill. Shikaku gestured behind him, to the massive television screen taking up most of the wall opposite the room's entrance. The matches will be decided at random, he said, and Sakura felt something cold run down her spine, raising the hairs on the back of her neck. They have not been prearranged, everything is thanks to a random number generator. He held up a remote, and pressed a button, the screen came to life and scrambled, names and numbers flying across it in complete chaos. We will now determine the matches. He pressed another button on the remote, and the screen flickered, names and numbers evaporating rapidly until only 2 remained. It was a slick presentation, Sakura had to admit, but in the back of her head she was wondering if the matches would truly be random. They only had Shikaku's guarantee, and sometimes, it would make more sense for the village to ensure that the right people were matched up with one another. the same way the villages fought their wars in minor countries. However, the very first names to pop up on the screen and remain there, faintly blinking black against a white background, made Sakura stop thinking that was the case immediately. Naruto Namikaze, Sasuke Uchiha. Naruto blinked, looking back to Sakura and past her in surprise. Sakura felt rooted to the floor. Her teammates had to fight each other? Only one of them could become Chunin? She didn't even know what to think or feel. Wasn't that simply too cruel? Interesting, Shikaku muttered. He pointed to Sakura's team, and then to the side of the room. You two, out of line. Naruto and Sasuke complied, leaving her alone. They both seemed just as stunned as her. Good luck, Naruto muttered, clapping his hand on her shoulder, and Sakura wished he'd left it there longer, to give her something to ground herself. It was as though she were starting to float away. She wouldn't have anyone to hide behind, anyone to help her or call out a warning. Sakura had never fought by herself. Would she have to fight one of her friends? What if she had to fight Tenten? She wouldn't have a chance. The screen flashed again, plucking two more names from the chaos. Suijutsu Hojiki, Rock Lee. Lee cheered, Suijutsu just smirked. They followed Shikaku's pointed finger out of the line, heading towards the same wall as Naruto and Sasuke. Sakura winced. Lee fought with his fists, and Suijutsu was apparently made of water. It was a bad matchup for Tenten's teammate, no matter how strong he was. Once again, the screen flashed. Niji Hyuga, Kankuro of the desert. The boy from Sand grunted, while Niji just glanced at him dismissively. They both made their way to the wall without Shikaku's instruction. The screen kept flashing. Sakura was getting worried. She didn't want to fight anyone who was left. Haku, or Tenten, or Kabuto, or Temari of the desert, Kabuto Yakushi. Kabuto gave the girl a smile. They didn't return it. Sakura was having to resist the urge to hyperventilate. There weren't any good options left for her. She felt alone and cold, standing with just 3 other people, 2 of which she respected immensely. It was like the world was drawing back, leaving her farther and farther from everyone else. The screen changed. Tenten, Hakuyuki. Sakura's heart stopped. Was that because an old and new friend would have to compete to become Chunin, or because of what it meant for her? Neither Tenten or Haku left immediately, despite Shikaku's wordless gesture. They both looked at her, seemingly a million miles away. Sakura could barely bring herself to turn towards them. Tenten, and Haku behind her, had eerily similar expressions, their eyes narrowed, their lips pressed together. They were worried for her, she realized. A billion miles away, on the wall, Naruto had his teeth bared, like it would make a difference. He'd been so afraid for himself, Sakura realized. What could he be feeling for her? The screen flashed on last time, the flicker of light involuntarily drawing Sakura's eye. She saw on it what she already knew. But seeing it there, spelled out in blocky black letters, still made her wish she could just sink into the ground and never come back up. She was sure she was going to throw up, but that would only make everything, somehow, even worse. Sakura Haruno, Gaara of the desert. Unable to resist the urge, she glanced at Gaara. He was staring at the screen, his expression unreadable. Before Sakura could look away, his eyes slid over to meet hers. In those eyes, the eyes of someone who'd hunted down more than 5 teams and murdered another, helpless one, there wasn't a single thing. They were as empty as the desert. Sakura looked away, trying to control her breathing and failing. She was scared. She didn't want to die. She didn't have a single chance. There was no way she'd become a Chunin. She should just forfeit right now. She tried to raise her hand, to say something, but terror locked up her muscles. She couldn't move an inch. That's that, then, Shikaku Nara said, and the screen went black with a flicker of static. You all have 1 month. The final will be held on February 2nd, in the Central Leaf Arena. He looked around, and Sakura could swear that when his eyes flitted over her, rooted in place in the center of the room, totally alone, there was a flash of pity in them. All teams are dismissed. It was that pity that made Sakura move, in the end. She turned, stiff and robotic, and walked towards her team. They met her in the middle. "Okay," Naruto said under his breath, and Sakura stared at him. "Okay. It's gonna be okay. We'll make this work," Sasuke said. Sakura looked at him, feeling a bit of life come back to her. Sasuke didn't look scared, just determined. "Sakura, you're going to be fine. Obito will make this work." He said it so confidently, Sakura thought. But that didn't make it true. Obito Sensei Chapter 16. Fear and Fury. Sakura walked through the next hour. Everything that happened seemed distant and cold, she remembered and understood, but it was only in hindsight that it made an impression on her. One by one, the teams left the tower. Sand was first, and then rain. They both watched Sakura as they left, but for different reasons. Tenten's team stayed for a while, quietly talking with them, but Sakura spent the conversation staring at the floor, the words washing over her. Eventually, they left as well, and it was just her, Naruto, Sasuke, and Shikaku. The Nara ushered them out of the training ground, and before Sakura knew it she was in the village, walking alongside her teammates and trapped inside her own head. I was prepared to fail, she thought to herself, the village grey and lifeless to her despite its winter finery. I told myself that from the beginning. It's my first exam. Most people don't pass the first time. I was totally ready to try again. But trapped in the grey village, Sakura realized that she had come so far, trounced another team, made allies with foreign shinobi, proved herself worthy of her sword, and all that had accomplished was plant a bitterness in her when she came up against an impassable obstacle at the finish line. Gaara of the desert. There wasn't any life in his eyes. He'd murdered the team from stone and removed almost every leaf ninja from the field. If he could do that, what chance did Sakura have against him? She should have forfeited there in the tower, before paralysis had taken her. That would have been less humiliating. Hey! Naruto's words were faint, and Sakura almost jumped when he seized her shoulder and lightly shook her. Hey! You home? What? Sakura asked, and Naruto gave her a concerned look. She looked around, not recognizing where they were. They were in one of Konoha's residential districts running alongside its largest canal. The homes here were squat and large, and trees sprouted everywhere seemingly at random, forming a thin shadowy canopy. Sorry. Don't be sorry, Sasuke said, glancing back at her. He was staring off at the canal, seemingly stuck in his own head as well. Sakura felt a flash of shame. While she was obsessing over the exam and Gaara, Sasuke had probably been struggling with the phantom of his brother. Itachi had appeared and vanished without a trace, and apparently left nothing but a broken arm in his wake. Can't believe you got matched with Gaara. Yeah. Sakura didn't know what else to say. Maybe there wasn't anything else to say in the first place. Yeah. Where are we? Naruto pointed. My house, he said, and Sakura blinked in surprise, following his finger. The home was like the others, with a short gate wrapped around the front of it enclosing a small, unkempt lawn. Naruto walked up without hesitation. Why would he hesitate? It was his own house, not just the Hokage's, and swung the gate open without a sound. Let's head in. We gotta figure this out. Sasuke followed after him as Naruto entered the yard, and after a moment of uncertainty, Sakura went too. Naruto opened the front door, and they all made their way into his home. It wasn't what Sakura had expected, though if she were honest with herself she didn't know what she had been expecting. The house was filled with plants, some hanging from the ceiling of the hall leading deeper into the home. The walls of the hall were lined with pictures. Some were of Naruto at all ages, others of the rest of the family, and a few of people Sakura didn't recognize, a huge man with long, spiky white hair and a wide smirk, a small boy with snow-white hair and a mask, and a man with the black hair and severe features of an Uchiha, wearing a kind smile at odds with his serious demeanor. Naruto led them down the hall to the other end of the home, and into the kitchen. It was big, twice the size of Sakura's, and one wall was dominated by a window that ran the length of the room. There were plants here too, including what Sakura could only describe as a small palm tree near the window. Beneath the wall-length window, there was a long, wide table made of a dark wood, with 2 chairs and 2 benches pulled up to it. It was empty, and there was a small clear stain on one corner. Naruto. A voice came from one of the adjoining rooms, and a woman entered the kitchen from the only other entrance, her face lighting up when she saw them. She wasn't very tall, but she was striking, with light blue eyes and long red hair. Sakura recognized her right away. Kushina Uzumaki, Naruto's mother. Wait. Sakura stopped, and Sasuke looked back at her with a questioning look. She shook her head. Uzumaki? Hey mom, Naruto grinned and gave a small wave. I brought Dash. His mother huffed and stormed up to him, sweeping him into a crushing hug, and Naruto squirmed and protested, legs kicking as he was lifted off the ground. Cut it out, he said with a laugh, and Kushina deposited him to the ground with a laugh that sounded just like her son. Congratulations. She smiled, first at him and then at all of them. Minato told me you all passed the second test. You're going on to the finals, you know? That's an amazing thing. Yeah. Naruto rubbed the back of his head. Did Dad tell you what happened? What happened? Kushina asked, and Naruto winced. Guess not, he muttered. The finals just gonna be a bunch of one-on-one matches. It usually is, his mother noted with a cocked eyebrow, looking around at all of them and picking up on their somber attitude. Sasuke and I got matched up, Naruto said, and somehow his mother's eyebrow rose even higher. And Sakura got set up with Gaara of the desert. That guy who Dash. I'm familiar, Kushina said shortly, and Sakura wondered why that was. No matter how intimidating he was, Gaara was still just a genin like the rest of them. Why would Naruto's mother already know about him? She guessed that the Hokage had already told her about what the shinobi from Sand had done in the forest. Kushina turned to face Sakura, and Sakura felt the gray that had dominated her vision recede even farther under the intense focus of the kunoichi. Kushina crossed her arms, looking Sakura up and down, her eyes appraising. You scared? She asked, and after a moment Sakura wordlessly nodded. What would be the point of lying? Good, Kushina said with a small laugh, and Sakura blinked. Gaara's going to be a hell of a guy to go up against, especially in an environment like the final. She stepped forward, extending one hand with a grin. I don't know if we've officially met before. Naruto's told me plenty about you, but I've never had you over. Sakura put out her own hand, and Kushina took it in a firm handshake, though her expression was anything but formal. It's nice to meet you, Sakura rehearsed, and Kushina frowned. Don't be so worried, she said. Her smile was just like Naruto's, and it made Sakura feel better just looking at it. Obito will take care of you, I guarantee it. If I know him, he's not gonna settle for anything less than you kicking that guy's ass. He's a freak, Sasuke muttered. Someone had better. Don't say that, Kushina said, her tone suddenly harsh, and Sakura resisted the urge to step backwards. So did Sasuke, obvious surprise flitting across his face. Naruto's mother grimaced. Sorry. What Dash? Naruto started to ask, and his mother shook her head. He's a victim of circumstances beyond his control, you know. She said. Even if he's the way he is, try not to hold it against him. She frowned. Maybe you'll understand later. I don't know. Mom, what are you talking about? Naruto demanded, stepping forward. That guy said it was his destiny to kill me, anyone like that Dash. Must have something really wrong with them, Kushina finished for him. Without a doubt. I'm just saying. She blew out a frustrated breath. I don't know what I'm saying. Do you guys want some lunch or something? You all gotta be starving. Lunch sounds nice, Sakura admitted, feeling more awake. Do you know where Obito is, Mrs. Uzumaki? Nope, Kushina said, wandering over to the fridge and rifling through it with abandon. She began pulling out ingredients at random. And don't call me that. It's just Kushina, Sakura. Sakura found it hard to believe that both of Naruto's parents had insisted on a first-name basis on the same day, but that was the reality she presented with. She sighed, and surrendered. Sorry, Kushina. Uzumaki. She couldn't get past the name. Sakura kept tripping over it. No problem. Kushina laid out a ridiculous amount of food on the table and began slapping something together that could vaguely be called a sandwich. Grab a seat. This should just take a sec. It took more than a second, and the end product was messy and fell apart twice, but when Sakura and her team were finished eating she felt almost human. Kushina sat across the table from her, and when Sakura sighed and expressed her thanks the woman just grinned and waved her off. Least I could do, she said, resting her chin on the back of her hand, arm propped up on the table. So? Her eyes slid over all three of them. What's your next move? You've got a month, what are you doing with it? Should we do anything? Naruto asked, and Sasuke glanced at him in disbelief. I'm gonna train, he said, and Naruto flicked a vegetable at him. Sasuke caught it out of the air and gently set it down on his plate, and Naruto rolled his eyes. For the first time that day, Sakura felt the urge to laugh, and didn't suppress it. She let out a little giggle as her teammates argued, and Kushina smiled at it. If you want to lose, feel free not to. I'm not gonna lose. Naruto declared. You're gonna lose. Whichever one of us wins will become Chunin, Sasuke said, and Sakura wondered if it really was that simple. I'm not going to treat this like a spar, Naruto. He was getting worked up, more so than was necessary. If you dash. He's not your brother, Kushina said softly, and Sasuke instantly deflated, looking down at the table. But it's good that you're both competitive. You should both do your best. She grinned. You've been ninja together since the beginning. You know your strengths and weaknesses. It'll be a good fight, don't you think? Maybe, Naruto admitted. I'd rather it be someone else though. Me too, Sasuke said quietly, and the nascent tension vanished. He glanced over. For now, we should focus on Sakura. I think. Sakura didn't quite know how to say it. I don't know if I should fight. Before you go that far, Kushina said, you should learn more about your opponent. She stood up, clearing their plates from the table. A shinobi is someone who endures and sacrifices, Sakura. If you think you're ready to be a Chunin, you'll fight. If you're not, you shouldn't go any farther, you know. It's that simple. Sakura didn't know if it was that simple, or what decision she should make at all, so she just nodded. All right, Kushina said, settling the plates in the sink. I don't know a thing about how Gaara fights, but I bet those other teams he took out do. She looked over her shoulder with a wry smile. I do know that both Team 8 and 10 are in the Eastern Hospital. Maybe you should give them a visit, huh? I bet they'd be happy to have had some of their classmates pass the second test. Good idea. Naruto shot to his feet. He'd been wanting to check on them anyway, Sakura knew. The other Leaf Ninja had been the first thing he'd asked his father about. Thanks Mom. No problem. Now, get going. Kushina shooed them out of the kitchen. Sakura looked back, still not sure if any of this was worth it, and the woman winked at her. You'd be amazed how quick a month can go, she said. Don't waste it, all right. Sakura nodded, and was the last out the door. ####. You got matched with him. Sakura nodded, her throat tightening. Shikamaru blew out a breath and sat back in his bed, wincing a little at the motion. His left leg was completely covered by a thick cast, and was elevated over the bed. So you two were the ones who actually fought him? Sasuke asked, looking from Shikamaru to the room's other occupant. Hinata. The girl nodded. Sakura thought she was putting on a brave face, and failing. Like Shikamaru, one of her legs was broken. However, she'd suffered something more than him. The ring finger on her right hand ended at the first joint. A bandage had been tied around the extremity, and as she fiddled with her fingers, something Hinata had always done, her left ring finger kept slipping through the gap, forgetting its partner was gone. Looking at her classmate fidget and seeing how pale she was, Sakura felt totally awake. Hinata had always been a gentle person, sometimes too gentle for her own good. Seeing her like that, there was a monstrous anger swelling up inside Sakura, burning away the shadows and fatigue that had clung to her ever since she'd risen from her sleepless night. That bastard. It was all of us, the girl said quietly. She looked around at the full room. Team 7 wasn't the only one there. Both Shikamaru and Hinata's teammates had squeezed into the hospital room, and had already been there when Sakura and her teammates had arrived. They all looked how Sakura felt, utterly furious. We tried to team up. We thought we could pass by handing in the scrolls together. We did the same thing, Sasuke said, watching the Hyuga intently. We ended up with the team from Rain. Everyone looked surprised at that, but the Uchiha ignored it. So Gaara tracked you both down. It was awful, Ino spoke up from the corner, and Sakura looked over at her. The Yamanaka gave her a haunted look. He was just. We all ganged up on him, Koji added. Shikamaru figured that 1 versus 6 would be good odds. Shikamaru laughed, gesturing at his leg. Bad idea. What did he do? Sakura said quietly. The anger in her couldn't stop growing, but it was nearly matched by fear. They both raced up her body in waves of heat and cold, making her feel flushed and confused. Was it some sort of jutsu? It was sand, Shino said. He was sitting in the corner, his legs crossed beneath him. He'd been so quiet that Sakura had almost forgotten he was there. He controlled sand. Not all of it, Shikamaru clarified. Some of it was automatic. Back up. Naruto made a reeling motion. Sand? Like, just a bunch of sand. The Nara nodded. Incredibly fast, incredibly strong sand, he confirmed. It came out of the gourd on his back. Kiba started to speak and Shikamaru glared at him, and the Inuzuka stayed quiet, sulking. Some of it was directed by him, that went after the attackers. The rest reacted automatically to attacks. It shielded him from Kiba and Hinata, even though they attacked from his blind spot. He leaned forward, interlacing his fingers under his chin. His teammates didn't even step in, they knew we didn't have a chance. It crushed my insects, Shino said. And nearly killed Akamaru, Kiba growled, and Hinata nodded. I saw it, she said, her voice faint and sad. Sakura wasn't sure whether she wanted to hug the girl or murder everyone who'd ever done her wrong. The sand was infused with his chakra. He must carry it with him everywhere, constantly pumping more and more chakra into it. His whole body is covered with it, like some sort of armor. He could direct it with just a thought. She shivered. And there was another chakra, inside of it. It only came out when it was defending him. Another chakra? Sasuke asked, and the Hyuga shook her head. I couldn't explain it. I could barely tell them apart. Maybe with your Sharingan, she said, before lowering her head. I was useless. You saved Akamaru. Kiba barked, his face twisting in fury. That bastard was about to crush him. From atop his head, his partner yipped in agreement. You weren't Dash. I'm sorry. Hinata shuddered. I'm sorry. Kiba shut up, looking stricken. It was another chakra, Ino said, quiet but certain. She crossed her arms and took a deep breath. Sakura, I hit him with my Shintenshin, after he caught Shikamaru. I thought I could. She choked. There was something there, inside him. It pushed me out immediately. It wasn't human. What do you mean? Sakura asked, and Ino could only shake her head. I don't know, she said. I'm sorry. I don't know. None of them knew how to respond to that. The room was silent. Your leg, Sasuke said after a moment. His hands had curled into fists, and he nodded at Shikamaru as he spoke, then at Hinata. His voice was like a razor. And yours. And your finger. What happened? He crushed it, Shikamaru laughed, and Sakura thought the sound was a little sick. He probably could have ripped it right off if he'd wanted to. I caught him with the shadow possession to start everything off, and he ignored it. He got a thoughtful look. His sand could attack and defend regardless of his body being restrained. It's really an incredible technique. I tried to jump away, but he caught me. The same happened to me, Hinata said. He caught me in the air when I got Akamaru out of the way, Kiba got away. Kiba looked down. He seemed ashamed. I tried to strike past it. She closed her eyes. The sand came up, like a blade. If I hadn't pulled back, I would have lost my whole hand. Sand that could attack, defend, and form blades, all autonomously, without Gaara moving. Inhuman chakra inside him. Sakura closed her eyes and rolled the situation over in her head, over and over until it was a well-worn stone. Her anger wore it down farther and farther, trying to reach the core. Right now, with her classmates wounded and so obviously frightened, she couldn't consider forfeiting. It didn't even cross her mind. "Are you gonna be okay?" Naruto asked, looking back and forth between Shikamaru and Hinata. The Nara shrugged. "Probably," he said. "The bone is intact. The only reason we're alive is because of that guy's teammates." He brought his hand up. He mimicked the motion, and the girls started screaming at him about how their father would punish all of them. That made him hesitate. He frowned. The Kaze cage must keep him on a real tight leash. After that, he just crushed our legs, and demanded our scrolls. "We turned them over," Koji said, shaking his head. "What else were we supposed to do?" "You did the right thing," Sakura said faintly, her eyes narrowing. "It was just a test. It wasn't worth that. Dying." Shikamaru said, and Sakura nodded. He laughed. "Seems that's all being a ninja is. Maybe the whole thing isn't worth it." Maybe, Sakura thought, but she didn't say it out loud. "What are you going to do then?" Ino asked. "Sakura, can you even fight that?" "I don't know," Sakura said. She looked at Shikamaru's leg, and Hinata's missing finger. She really didn't know. Gaara had defeated 2 teams without moving. In all likelihood, she couldn't even be a speed bump to him. But the fear inside her was fading, and the anger was all that remained. ####. When Obito found them on the roof of the academy, the sun was starting to set. Team 7 had grabbed an early dinner and was eating it on top of the building, a mix of dumplings and rice from a food cart. Naruto was practicing his balance while he ate, crouching on the railing surrounding the roof and not using chakra to stick himself in place. When Obito appeared in a spiral of chakra from out of nowhere, Naruto almost slipped and fell off. Their sensei looked around, his eyes eventually fixing on Sasuke as his strange 7-point Sharingan receded. Sasuke was sitting beside Sakura on the steps that led from one part of the roof to the other, and he gave Obito a look as the man's Sharingan fully vanished. Their sensei shook his head, and Sasuke looked down. "Sorry, Sasuke," Obito said, stepping forward to join them as Naruto inched back over the railing, carefully holding his meal in one hand. "I couldn't catch him." "Don't worry about it," Sasuke said with a frown, taking another bite from a dumpling. "I didn't think you would." "Hey now," Obito said, coming to a stop next to them and turning to sit at Sasuke's side. "Have a little more faith in me." "I don't think there's a person in the world you couldn't catch, Obito," Sasuke said quietly. "Except for Itachi." Their sensei scratched at the scar that ran past his jaw. "Yeah," he said eventually. "Maybe you're right." He looked past Sasuke to Sakura, and smiled a little dourly. "I heard you visited the hospital." "Rin?" Sakura asked, and Obito nodded. Rin didn't work at the Eastern Hospital usually, but she was a Jonin and one of the heads of Konoha's medical division. When it came to the injured, she was as good as omniscient. Sakura knew that, at least. "Yeah," her sensei said. "I also heard who you were matched up with." His eyes narrowed. "Looking for some information." "Mom sent us that way," Naruto said, hopping down off the railing and striding over. "She said the other guys might know something about Gaara." "She was right," Sasuke said. "Oh." Obito crossed his arms, looking at Sakura. "What did you learn?" Sakura swallowed a bite of rice, thinking it over and watching the sun set behind her sensei. "He can control sand," she said, and Obito nodded. "He doesn't need to move to do it, and it's fast enough that it caught all of Team 8 and 10 off guard. He was immune to both the shadow possession because of that, and the mind-body switch jutsu because of another chakra inside him." Obito looked a little surprised at that. Sakura took another bite, chewing thoughtfully and marveling at her own calmness. "The sand can defend him automatically, but it seems like he has to direct it to attack, because he didn't kill Hinata right away, only blocked her attack." That's good, Obito said, and Sasuke felt a bit of warmth at the praise. Do you think you can win? Right now? Sakura asked, and her sensei nodded. No. I don't stand a chance. Okay, that's good, Obito said, and then laughed at Sakura's expression and Naruto's protest. That you're being realistic. You've got a handle on the situation. That's the good part. That means the important question is. He mulled for a moment, and then smiled. Do you want to win? Sakura thought about it. She wasn't ambitious, and she didn't resent people, she'd always thought. But you can't let that guy just walk away. Her eyes narrowed. I don't want to lose. Close enough. Obito grinned. More than close enough. He leaned forward. You're scared, I can see it. That's also good. A lot of the time, that's what being a ninja is, you know. Only a real idiot isn't scared. Sakura felt more angry than scared right now, but she'd never known Obito to be wrong when it came to observing people. Are you angry, or are you just using that to cover your fear? No way my dad's ever been scared, Naruto declared, and Obito turned to him with a wry look. You should ask him sometime, he said. I can guarantee that Sensei's probably been more scared than you've ever been. He has a lot more to worry about, you know. Naruto looked a little shocked, but it made sense to Sakura. The Hokage wasn't just a ninja, they were someone who had to balance the village, the shinobi system, the economy driven by violence, the demands of the daimyo, both fires and foreigners, and even more all on their back. She couldn't imagine how difficult or how frightening the position could be. Compared to that, a single deranged ninja like Gaara was nothing. Obito, Sasuke said, and their sensei turned towards him. Sensei, he said with exasperation, and Sasuke rolled his eyes. Obito Sensei, he said with a grin, and Obito grinned back. Naruto and I are just up against each other. You heard? Yeah. Interesting match, Obito said. You both gonna dash. We're gonna train with our families, Naruto cut in, sitting down on the floor in front of all of them. I don't want this guy knowing about what I'm working on. Sasuke chuckled. Same goes for you, I guess, he said, and Naruto gave him a mean grin. We're both gonna try our best, he continued to Obito. And we've all agreed, he said, gesturing between himself, Sakura, and Sasuke, that you should focus on Sakura. We're not gonna kill each other, but Gaara. He grew a little quiet, looking at Sakura with a subdued expression. If Gaara thinks he can get away with it, he'll definitely kill her. Sensei, Sakura said when Naruto was finished. I want to train with you, for the month. I don't know if I can win, but I don't want to just. She struggled with the words, and they finally burst out of her, unable to be controlled. I don't want to just give up. She shot to her feet, the whole team looking at her with surprise. After what he did to Hinata, and Shikamaru, and that team from Stone, it's unforgivable. She knew that she was saying too much, speaking too loudly, but she couldn't contain herself. Someone has to teach him a lesson. Obito's mouth opened and closed, her sensei was clearly unsure how to respond to her outburst. Naruto had no such hesitation. Exactly. He said, coming to his feet as well. You've got to show him, Sakura. He grinned, fierce and furious, and for the first time in her life Sakura felt like they were equals, on the same plane and feeling the same thing. He can't just go around killing people. If you've got the chance, you've got to show him that. If that's really how you feel, Obito said, slowly standing up, we should probably get started right away. Sasuke was the only one left sitting, and he looked around curiously, taking another bite of his dumpling. There's a lot of work to get done, and there's no time to lose. You have to tell me what to do, Sakura said. Her heart felt like a stone, and her mind like steel. She was furious, the anger pushing her forward. I don't even know where to start. You're stupid if you think that will last forever. When the month's done, will you still be angry? She pushed the voice back. In that moment, Sakura was sure she had enough anger for the rest of her life. It wasn't just Gaara that her fury was directed at, it was the entire world that had brought him into existence. Everything Haku had told her just 20 hours ago was mixing together with the blank eyes of the boy from sand, and all Sakura could feel at that was frustration and a desire to tear him down. I don't want to be scared, she told herself. I'm sick of being scared. I want to fight. If I'm going to be a ninja, I want to be the best one possible. Okay, her sensei said, a faint smile creeping over his face. Leave it to me then. For today, just get some rest. We'll be starting tomorrow. Sakura smiled back. Hashtag. Asuma. At around midnight, Obito burst into a bar somewhere in the south of Konoha, and Asuma Sarutobi, Kurane Ui, and several other ninja glanced up from their table, drinks, and cards. Obito. The third Hokage's son asked, looking a little flushed. Kurane scowled next to him, nursing her drink. What are you doing? It wasn't a secret in Konoha that Obito didn't drink, it was definitely unusual to find him in a bar. I need your help, Obito said, striding over to the table, and Kurane snorted. Your team passed, she said, obviously a little tipsy. Why are you the one needing help? She leaned her drink back and forth, watching the liquid inside rise and fall. Your students are all fine. Sakura's going up against Gaara alone, Obito said. He didn't take a seat. You know what that means. Yeah, Asuma admitted, sliding off his chair and to his feet. What are you saying? I'm saying, if you wanna make sure your teams didn't get knocked out for nothing. Obito shook his head. No, sorry. That's not right. I don't want what happened to Hinata and Shikamaru to happen to Sakura. I want your help. I'm figuring something out. Oh. At that, Kurane looked up. What do ya mean? Both your teams collected a lot of info about how Gaara fights, Obito said, and Kurane rose from the table too, to a chorus of heckling from the other ninja there. Obito rolled his eyes. Wanna head outside? The two Jonin sensei followed him out the door, the cool night air sobering them up a little. Asuma sighed and pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a snap of his fingers, and Kurane let him get away with it, offering only a sardonic glance. He's a terrifying opponent, Obito said, looking up at the stars. So distant and bright, he thought. He smiled. Sakura's not there yet, she's not going to be able to take him on even footing, no matter how much I train her for the month before the final. That's a given, Asuma said. He's a Demjin Shuriki. It's never gonna be a fair match. He took a deep puff of his cigarette and breathed out, settling himself. What are you thinking? I'm still figuring it out, Obito said. But I got the start of something, and I think I'm gonna need you for some of it. It's not really my specialty. You're being pretty coy, Kurane said slyly, and Obito shuffled his feet. Not like you, Obito. I don't wanna. Obito started to say, and then gave up, frustrated. I wish I could teach her myself. But something like Gaara, with that sand, my Sharingan has always given me the tools to surpass that sort of thing. I haven't had to develop the skills to defeat it with normal jutsu. He rubbed his temple, and then grinned, one of his eyes flashing red in the dim light of the street. You're not like me, you two. You've got your specialties, but you've put something into just about everything. All I've got are copies. Sakura is going to need something new, and I don't know if I can make that. Asuma chuckled. All you've got is a lack of confidence, he said, his lips heating up and burning the cigarette to ash. Obito frowned, and Asuma shook the ash out into the lightly blowing wind. But I won't lie, helping train someone to take down that little punk does sound pretty appealing. You'll help? Obito asked, and Asuma grunted. I'll come by tomorrow and check her out, he said. Kurane took his arm and began leading him away, and he called back over his shoulder at Obito. If I like what I see, I'll consider it. Obito watched the two Jonin walk into the night, and then looked back at the stars. If he was being honest with himself, he was terrified. He hadn't shown that to Sakura, couldn't, and he wouldn't dare show it to any of the other Jonin. He was Mangekyo no Obito, he had no right to be scared. But he'd seen what remained of the team from stone, left out like smears from an overly ambitious butcher bird, and he'd seen Sakura in every one of them. It was like a tribute, he thought. He tribute to something he couldn't understand, a message in crushed bone and solidified blood. Even if there was no way in hell he'd let Sakura become another tribute, the fear gnawed at him all the way back to his apartment. It was an old fear, burning anew with concern for his student. You're a ghost, Obito. You were blessed with the power to save yourself from whatever the world threw at you. But only yourself. Obito Sensei Chapter 17. Sakura's Potential. Sakura and her sensei danced across the training field in the bright morning sun, and for the 5th time that day there was a loud ring of steel. Obito's sword flashed out and Sakura's flew away, shinobi and blade skittering across the dirt in different directions. Sakura scrambled after her sword and whipped it off the ground as she came back to her feet, panting with the effort. Obito advanced on her, remorseless. His Sharingan was active, his left eye was closed. He was totally untouched. Again, he demanded, and then he lunged. Her arms were shaking and her body was covered in sweat, but Sakura refused to back down. She bared her teeth and met Obito's short sword with her blade, knocking it back and kicking out at her sensei's gut. The kick passed right through him, and Obito spun out of the attack, his hand coming around. Sakura raised her arm in a hasty block, and his closed fist crashed into her, knocking her sideways and sending her tumbling head over heels. She didn't release her sword, but when she came back to her feet, Obito was already in her face. He kicked out, trying to knock her blade out of her hands, and Sakura leapt backwards, the air pressure of the missed kick throwing her hair up. Sakura had always wanted to train with her sensei alone, especially after she'd taken up her sword. She hadn't expected it would be like this. She lashed out, and her blade passed harmlessly through Obito's leg. He kicked out again, and this one took Sakura in the gut and sent her flying back. It felt like a hot iron had been slammed into her stomach, all the air in Sakura's lungs vanished in an instant, and she hit the ground and rolled in pain, one hand pressed to her stomach and the other holding up her sword. Her sensei reached out, fingers settling and sticking on the sides of her sword, and tried to yank it from her grip. Lying on her back and struggling to breathe, Sakura stubbornly held on. Her back lifted off the ground, Obito grinned down at her. "Screw you." "All right," her sensei said, letting go of the sword. Sakura flopped to the earth, gasping for air, and Obito knelt down and extended his hand. "Well done." Sakura took the offered hand, and Obito hauled her to her feet, glancing off to his right for a moment. "You okay?" he asked, looking back to her, and Sakura nodded, not sure if she could speak. Her whole body ached, her arms and core especially. She was going to have some incredible bruises. It had only been 10 minutes, and she already felt like falling down and not getting back up. "I think you showed enough," Obito said with a friendly smile. He glanced away again, to their watcher. "Don't you?" Asuma Sarutobi was leaning against a tree at the edge of the training ground, unshaven and taking the occasional sip from a canteen. He'd been watching their spar with mild interest. At least, that's what Sakura had managed to see in passing as Obito had disarmed her time and time again. She didn't know much about Team 10's sensei, other than that he was the third Hokage's son. The man was intimidating though, tall and rough-looking. "She's enthusiastic," Asuma said, pushing himself off the tree and wandering towards them. He took a cigarette from his breast pocket, but he didn't light it. Sakura gave him a questioning look, and he squinted at her. But that's never enough on its own. He took the final steps, drawing up before Sakura and Sensei. He was a tall and broad man, over 6 feet, and dwarfed both of them. Sakura felt like his shadow had fallen over her, even though the sun was at her back. "Put out your hand," he said mildly, and Sakura complied, sticking out her left hand with an open palm. Asuma plopped down his cigarette on her palm. "Rotate it," he said, and Sakura looked from him to Obito in confusion. "Without touching it." "Spin it around." "Asuma." Obito muttered, and the man laughed. "If she can't do this, I won't be any use here," he said. Sakura still wasn't sure what was going on, but the man's tone was rude, and it caused something inside her to boil. "So, show me I should stick around." "Spin it around, Pinky." "With just my chakra?" Sakura asked, struggling to stay polite, and Asuma nodded, looking down to pluck another cigarette from his pocket. course, he said, fiddling with whatever else was in his pocket. He kept his head down, not looking at her, and Sakura's nostrils flared. Chakra is what makes a ninja. Without it, you're just a thug with a knife. If you can't dash. The cigarette in Sakura's hand spun so violently that it took flight, springing up in the air and bouncing off Asuma's nose. The Jonin blinked, and behind Sakura, Obito loudly snorted. As soon as she'd done it, Sakura regretted the trick, but Asuma didn't yell, or leave. He just stood there for a moment, apparently shocked. Do that again, he said, and Sakura was the one to blink this time. She asked intelligently, and Asuma somewhat fervently pressed another cigarette into her palm. Do that again, he demanded once more, and Sakura couldn't refuse him. Her chakra extended slightly out of her palm, picking the cigarette just a millimeter up off her skin and spinning it around like a small fan. After a moment, she shoved, and the rotating stick sprung off her palm, up towards Asuma's face once more. He caught it out of the air between two fingers, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at her. Did you show her that? He asked Obito, his voice suspicious, and Obito shrugged and raised his hands in a helpless gesture, and Sakura watched the two adults with confusion. Did you know dash? I didn't know you'd ask her to do that. No, Obito cut him off. He glanced at Sakura. It's like I told you. She's a natural. It's like the raised non, Sakura spoke up. Why were they staring at her? I can't do it myself, but it's the same principle, right? Just rotating the chakra in your palm. Asuma didn't blink. The cigarette lit in his hands, and he took a thoughtful puff, staring at her long enough for Sakura to grow uncomfortable. Keep up your spar, he decided after a second, turning away. I'll be right back. Where are you going? Obito asked, and Asuma rolled his eyes. Your sensei here is a dumbass with no confidence, he told Sakura, and she had to strongly resist the urge to punch him right in the face. He asked me to help you cause he wasn't sure he could come up with something that you could beat Gaara with. He laughed. Who knows if anyone could? But I've got an idea. So stick around, will you? Then he was gone in a swirl of leaves, and Sakura and Obito were alone again. He's rude, Sakura said, her fist tightening around her sword. Obito grinned at her. He's honest, her sensei said, and Sakura realized for the first time in her life that Obito didn't realize just how amazing he was. Come on, let's take his advice. Taijutsu this time. He'll be back soon. By the time Asuma returned, Sakura had several exciting new bruises. Here, he said, tossing something to her sensei. Sakura only saw a glimpse, but it looked like a small jar with a silver clasp. Obito popped it open and then cocked an eyebrow, glancing up at Asuma. So soon? He asked, and Asuma snorted. Her control is exceptional, he said, and Sakura felt a flush of pride. If she wants to do more than run away, she'll have to have something up her sleeve. Obito delicately plucked something out of the jar. It was a piece of plain white paper, Sakura realized, folded into a square. What do you mean, Asuma-sensei? Sakura asked, feeling even more embarrassed at the urge she'd had to punch him. The man frowned. Gaara's a unique opponent, he said. You'll need an equally unique jutsu to stand a chance. Academy stuff won't do. What kind of jutsu? She asked, and the older man shrugged as Obito thoughtfully twirled the paper in his fingers. I don't know, he said, and Sakura felt a chill. That's what we're going to find out. Beside her, Obito approached, extending the paper. He held it delicately between two fingers. Sakura, he said. She thought he seemed a little grave. You probably don't recognize this, right? Sakura cocked her head. It's paper, isn't it? Obito laughed. Yeah, it's paper. But it's a special kind of paper, he said, and Sakura felt another jolt of embarrassment. This is chakra inductive paper, it's made from special trees, like the founding trees, that are fed chakra from the day they're planted. It's very sensitive to molded chakra. We're going to use this to determine your elemental nature. Elemental jutsu? Already? Even with her newfound determination, the notion just made Sakura feel uncertain. Even Naruto didn't have any elemental jutsu, Sasuke was the only person her age who she knew that did, and he had always been a prodigy. With just a month to train, could she really pick up a whole new skill set? Even if she did, would it be the right thing to face Gaara with? Even if she got a new jutsu, what could possibly surpass his sand shield? Something must have shown on her face, because Obito chuckled. "This is a good place to start," he said, and recessed the paper into her hand. "Trust me. Just run your chakra through it." Sakura did her best to banish her doubt, failed, and took the paper from Obito, holding it between her thumb and index finger. She focused, trying to push her chakra into it, and was astonished to find the paper soaked it up without effort, almost like a magnet. She barely needed to extend her chakra beyond her hand before the paper took it in. The material crumpled, dampness racing up from where Sakura's fingers made contact, until the whole thing was drooping and wet. Obito pursed his lips as he watched, and Sakura looked up at him with uncertainty. "Does that mean water?" she asked. "The opposite of fire. Sasuke wouldn't be able to help her at all. In fact, she didn't know anyone who used water jutsu." Obito nodded, confirming her fear. "Water," he said, half muttering. "Weak to earth, too." "That doesn't matter," Asuma said, crossing his arms. "It's not like she would be able to overwhelm Gaara's jutsu head-to-head anyway, no matter what she got done this month." He grinned. "In fact, it might help. He'll probably underestimate her, if he understands the elemental disadvantage." Weak to earth. Sakura stared at the paper, the world shrinking down to it. Even her elemental affinity was at a disadvantage against Gaara. Her bruises ached worse and worse, and her legs were shaking. Just a single morning of training with her sensei, and the uncertainty that she had started loathing so violently was already creeping back into her. "Hey," her sensei said, and she snapped out of it, looking back at him. "Don't get sucked in." "Sensei. I know you're scared," he said. "But try not to think about that right now. You told me you wanted to fight, and I'm going to help you make that happen." "Asuma too." He gestured at the other man, who was still standing there with his arms crossed. "We're going to train your Ken and Taijutsu the rest of the week, alright? If you want to stand up to Gaara, the first thing we've got to improve is your speed and stamina. Once that's at an acceptable level, we're going to move on to your affinity. Asuma and I will worry about that, so for now, just focus on yourself, okay?" With the rising sun behind him, Sakura felt there was something more than ordinary to her sensei's words. She nodded, doing her best to internalize his words. "Okay," she said, handing the damp paper back and drawing her sword. In response, her sensei drew his. "Okay. Then let's start again. ####. When Sakura arrived home 2 days later, shortly after sunset, her parents were waiting for her. She stumbled through the door, dead on her feet, and only realized she wasn't alone when there was a squeal of joy. Sakura. That was her mother, who swept her up off the floor and crushed her to her chest, sending flares of pain up across her chest and back from the multitude of bruises there. "Congratulations, Mom," she mumbled, and her mother set her down, beaming at her. "We heard the news as soon as we got back," she said, and behind her Sakura's father stepped out into the entry hall, wearing an identical grin. "It's incredible, Sakura. You made it into the final on your very first time? We almost couldn't believe it." "I only made it because of my team," Sakura thought, but she didn't speak her mind. She just smiled at her mother instead, enjoying her grin and the way she was squeezing her shoulders, even if it hurt a little. "We heard about who you were up against too," her father said, his grin shrinking. "The Kazekige's son, huh?" He looked her up and down, and Sakura was suddenly very self-conscious of the bruises covering her body. "Looks like you're taking it seriously." She nodded. "I thought about just giving up, when the match was announced," she said, her eyes slipping closed in a too long blink for a second. She really was exhausted. Obito Sensei had explained that he was trying to push her to her physical limit to expand her tolerance, and so far he'd done a serious job of it. He killed that team from stone by himself, but after what he did to the others, my classmates, I felt like I couldn't just forfeit. Her hands curled into fists, and her father watched her carefully. "That's good," he said. Her mother was frowning, stepping back from her a little. "But, Sakura, sometimes it's okay to give up, you know." "What?" Sakura asked, and her father leaned against the hallway wall, stroking his chin. "Honey, we just don't want you getting hurt," he said, and Sakura stared blankly at him. "You made it into the final, that alone is an incredible achievement. After that first C rank." He trailed off. "I told you it was a wide world, remember? The Kazekige's son is another part of that. Sometimes, there are fights you can't win. In a situation like that, sometimes you just have to retreat. That's what being a ninja is." "What are you saying?" Sakura asked, feeling herself start to tremble. "You don't want me to fight." "It's not that," her mother said, shooting a glance back at her father. "We just don't want you to lose. That kid." Her face twisted. "He's a monster. You know that, right?" Sakura thought about the team from Stone, about how scared the boy who'd watched her from the ground had looked. About Shikamaru's leg, and Hinata's missing finger. "I know," she said, her voice low, and her father narrowed his eyes. "We'll talk about this later," he said, suddenly cheerful. "You look exhausted. Come on, we both fixed dinner. It's been a while since we ate together." He was right, and so Sakura followed them into the kitchen without protest. But inside her chest, something was boiling. Sometimes, there are fights you can't win. ####. All right. Obito set down both of the buckets he'd carried to the field, and Sakura gave them a doubtful look. It had been 6 days since their first day of training, and her sensei had told her he was satisfied with her progress. Sakura hadn't been sure, but she was already starting to feel stronger, lighter on her feet. Her sensei had spent the last 3 days teaching her tricks for chakra control, all based on improving her speed and finesse. How to channel it to her legs in precise bursts for mid-combat shunshin, when to leap and when to roll. Sakura had always thought of chakra as just part of herself, an energy that danced beneath her skin, but Obito had opened her eyes to another reality. It wasn't just a burn that could carry her forward, it was a detonation that could hurl her at incredible speeds. With hindsight, Sakura had realized that this was what Sasuke had been doing for as long as she'd known him, the secret to his explosive speed. It made her feel pretty incredible, to move in a way that made the world blur. She still wasn't even close to Obito, not even remotely, but by the 5th day, she'd at least understood how he'd gotten there. "Stamina training is done for now," Obito said, telling her what she already knew. "We're gonna move on to nature control now." He grinned. "I'm gonna warn you right now, this is going to be really boring." "Boring?" Sakura gave the buckets another glance. They were both huge, bigger than her torso, nearly overflowing with water. "What do you mean, sensei?" "Come here, and I'll show you." Obito beckoned her forward, and Sakura levered herself off the ground and hobbled over, her legs aching with both lactic acid and chakra shock. Tomorrow, she'd be strong, but today, she was just sore. It would always be that way. "Now, watch carefully," Obito said, and he knelt down in front of one of the buckets. As Sakura watched, he placed one hand on the surface of the water and closed his eyes, focusing. Slowly, he drew his hand up, and the water followed it, stuck fast to his palm. He pulled it up 1 foot, 2, and then after another couple inches he sighed and the small pillar of water collapsed, splashing back into the bucket. "Water isn't my specialty," he said, rising back to his feet. "Like a lot of Uchiha, my nature is fire. That said, I still have a lot more experience than you." He gestured to the ground in front of the bucket. "Grab a seat, okay?" Sakura obliged, coming down on both knees in front of the bucket. "Start out with 2 hands, and control the water like I did. Bring it up to your head's level. When you've got that, we'll move on to the next stage, all right?" Obito took a step back, and Sakura nodded, bringing both hands down towards the water. She placed both on the surface, and recalled the lessons of water walking. This was the same thing, she thought, just further abstracted. She molded chakra in her core, gently pushing it down her arms and into her hands and fingers. She felt her hands adhere to the water, and pulled it up. The water came up willingly, but unlike the pillar Obito had created, Sakura was just left with a coating under her hands, like a layer of jello. She stared at it, and huffed in frustration. Duh. Water walking only adhered you to the top layer of water molecules. If she did the same thing here, she'd only take a bit of water with her. She dropped her hands back down, totally absorbed in the task. Sakura had always been able to ignore the rest of the world for whatever was in front of her. It was what had served her so well academically, and what made it so easy for her to get lost in herself when she was full of doubt or fear. But right now, it was good. It was helpful. The only thing that existed in the world was her chakra, and the bucket full of water. You have to go further than water walking, she told herself. If you want to create a pillar, your chakra needs to saturate the water and totally control it. Otherwise, it'll just collapse right away. She sent her chakra down, out of her hands, and into the water. To her anger, it dissipated almost immediately if it went too far from her hands. She probed deeper, trying to construct a spike of sorts that would permeate the water, but even that started to disintegrate with too much distance from her hands. She just couldn't project enough chakra outside her body in a consistent manner to saturate the water. It's not about saturation, her sensei suddenly said, and Sakura jerked, her heart skipping a beat. Obito was staring down at her in the water with his Sharingan active. He'd obviously been watching what she'd been trying to do. Some people can pull that off, but you aren't one of them right now. He squatted down. You can't just fill the water with your chakra. If you were doing that, it might even be more efficient to transform your own chakra into water. He waved off her question before she could voice it. That's pretty advanced, you won't be learning it in a month, so we're not going to try. Then what's the trick? Sakura asked. If I can't fill the water up. She resisted the urge to slap herself. I've gotta shape it. That means covering it, right? Obito smiled at her, and she felt her confidence spread through her chest like an oxygenated flame. It's a liquid. I just need to give it a new container. Exactly right. Obito clapped. Like I told Asuma, you're a natural. He stood back up, Sharingan slowly spinning. Give it a try. Sakura nodded and looked back down, flexing both her fingers and settling her palms on the water once more. This time, she went slower, channeling her chakra more cautiously. She mimicked the spike approach, but instead of sending it directly into the water, she sent her chakra out around her palms, keeping it active and ready. Her palms buzzed with the sensation, and she drew her hands up in a patient motion. To her delight, the water followed her. As it came up, Sakura sent more chakra down through her hands and into the water beneath it. Not to fill it up with her aura, but to surround it and create a buttress around the pillar that was steadily forming. More and more water was drawn out of the bucket, and Sakura grew more and more confident. Her fingers closed in slightly, desperate to keep the pillar's shape. When it reached her chest level, the strain grew to be too much. She hadn't been efficient enough with her chakra, and she couldn't apply enough brute force to keep the water structure from wobbling. Instead of fighting it, Sakura breathed out and let it collapse. Obito stepped forward, and she glanced up at him. I'm starting over, she said. He'd looked concerned for a second. Had he thought she'd given up? Like her parents thought she should? Sakura hoped not. Right now, it seemed like her team were the only people who thought she should actually fight Gaara. I need a better foundation. All right, her teacher said. It's your show. If you need help, just ask, okay? Sakura nodded, but she didn't ask for help. An hour later, she brought the pillar of water higher than her head, and held it there for 2 minutes before it collapsed. Obito watched the whole thing with a perplexed expression. Sakura wasn't sure why. Had she done something wrong? Okay, he eventually said. Okay then. He laughed and crossed his arms. One hand now. Ready. Sakura nodded, and started again, ignoring the sweat pouring down her forehead. It took her another 4 hours to manage the same feat with one hand. After that, Obito suggested they get some lunch. At first, Sakura wanted to keep going. Then she realized she was wheezing with every breath. Yeah, she gasped. Lunch would be good. They had a hearty meal at a restaurant Sakura didn't know the name of. Her sensei ordered her a plate full of rice, vegetables, meat, and an unidentifiable but delicious sauce, and Sakura worked through it with embarrassing speed. Afterwards, he sent her home. Chakra control tests aren't a joke, he told her. This isn't going to be like training your speed. Projecting that much chakra out of your body is going to exhaust you in no time. If you want to be efficient, you're going to be sleeping and eating a lot for the next couple weeks, so get used to it. Your chakra stamina is going to improve, but this first week will be rough. Accept that now, alright. Sakura nodded, feeling like her lips were gummed shut. In the moment, she'd been too thrilled to notice how tired she was. Now, she could barely feel her limbs. She was just a head and a floating torso, wobbling through the village vaguely in the direction of her home. When she reached her door, she didn't even knock. She just stumbled inside. Her mother was home, and met her in the hall. Sakura? She asked, and to Sakura it seemed that her mother's voice was echoing down to her. Home so early? Chakra control, she said, her words slightly slurring. Sensei said sleep. Her mother said some other stuff, but Sakura barely heard it as she was herded up the stairs to her room. She collapsed in her bed, and her mother helped her undress. As she slipped under the covers and into sleep, the same thought was playing in her exhausted brain on repeat. I gotta get stronger. Tomorrow, I'll go longer. She didn't wake up until the sun had set. Obito Sensei Chapter 18. Mothers. When Naruto drove his Rasengan into the tree, the whole thing pretty much exploded. He glanced over his shoulder and beamed, and at the end of the clearing his mother sarcastically clapped once. Well done, she said with a twinkle in her eye. You've murdered a helpless tree. Yeah, Naruto admitted. But it's like, super murdered, right? He gestured at what was left, barely a stump sticking out of the ground. That's good, you know? It means my control's getting better. That's true, Kushina admitted, walking forward and examining the stump. But you're not planning on using that jutsu on Sasuke, are you? No way. Naruto shook his head. It's way too dangerous. I wouldn't want to kill him. That's good. His mother smiled. Still, it is pretty impressive, Naruto. Good job. Thanks. He rubbed the back of his head, beaming. Kushina wasn't slow to praise him, but Naruto always took every bit he got with the same amount of gratitude. He looked down at his hand, tightening it into a fist. Even if it's not gonna be a super serious fight, I still don't wanna lose to him. I'm sure he's feeling the same way, his mom told him with a grin. Especially if I know Mikoto. No doubt she's training with him, and pretty hard. Yeah. Naruto looked around. Where's Dad? I thought he told you he'd drop by. His mother frowned. Naruto was used to his dad being busy. He was the Hokage, after all. But lately, he'd been seeing less and less of them. He wasn't really worried about it, but he was starting to notice the absence. Still sorting things out with stone and sand, she said, and Naruto felt a frown of his own come on. That creepy bastard. It really was all his fault. You know, with that genin team. Yeah, he muttered. Yeah, I bet. How's Sakura doing? His mom asked, shifting the subject. She never came by again. She's training her ass off, Naruto said frankly, and his mother rolled her eyes. Language, she tsked, and Naruto laughed. I don't know what else to call it. He said, flopping down onto his butt. I've only seen her in Obito twice in like, 2 weeks. Just like his dad, he was starting to miss her. And both times I did, she was all covered in bruises. He made a rubbing motion of his face and arms, and super pale. Obito told me she was pushing herself really hard, almost into chakra exhaustion, every day. She's taking it seriously, Kushina said, and Naruto nodded. She saw that guy, when he said he was supposed to kill me, he said, a little subdued. And he fought that team from Stone alongside the Rain guys too. They weren't pushovers. If Gaara really killed all of them. He sighed, trying not to think about it. Whenever he did, he got scared. He didn't want Sakura to die. Even imagining it made him shiver. Yeah. She's taking it seriously. Good, Kushina said, sitting down next to him. If she knows that, then Obito will know too. He'll make sure she's ready by the end of the month. I hope so, Naruto said, twiddling with the grass at his feet. I don't, all she's got is her sword. She's really good with it, but against that guy's sand. He plucked up several blades and threw them away. Hey, he thought, that was a neat metaphor. He took on Team 8 and 10 at the same time and won. Yeah, that's pretty scary, his mom said, which didn't make him feel better. But you'll just have to trust her and Obito, and your dad. Sakura wants to fight, and they won't let her die. Dad? Naruto asked, and his mom tapped her nose knowingly. If she really gets in trouble, he'll bail her out. She laughed. The same goes for Gaara, if she trains enough. Who knows? The point is, he's unwilling to let anyone else die. That's good. Hearing that mollified him a little bit, but Naruto still felt himself plucking at the grass. But you know, Dad always says being a shinobi is about sacrifice. Wouldn't that? Everyone has their own way of being a shinobi, Kushina said. That's just your father, a lesson he learned the hard way, I think. She smiled sadly. Being Hokage is a difficult job. That's why I never wanted it, Naruto said, half joking. He bobbed his head thoughtfully. Kabuto said the same thing, about shinobi. Kabuto? His mom asked. The guy from Rain. Yeah, Naruto said. He'd told both his parents about the Rain team, but not much more than their names. When we were at the tower, he told us that everyone had their own reason. Every shinobi, I mean. He looked up thoughtfully. Cause Lee said that being a shinobi was about seeking out a powerful foe. So I guess he didn't really agree with that. Well, that's a pretty mature thing to say, Kushina said with a little laugh. What do you mean? Naruto asked, and his mother shifted a little, glancing at the Hokage monument. It was partly obscured behind some trees, but still stared out over the village. A lot of ninja wouldn't put it that way, Kushina said. They think that their way of being a shinobi, whether it's looking for someone strong, or killing enemies of the village, or being a tool, enduring, sacrificing. She trailed off. They can't look at it another way. They just call it wrong, and move on. Kabuto wasn't the only one who was a little weird like that, Naruto said. They all were. That whole team. Maybe the whole Rain village is like that. There's some strange ones, Kushina said with a smile. But the Akatsuki has always been honest in its beliefs. Her smile vanished. Even if they can be a little extreme. How? Naruto asked, and his mother shook her head. It's not really important right now. Are you going to keep training? Nah. He lay back with his hands behind his head. I'm kinda bored. He grinned and rolled backwards, coming to his feet. I think I'll go bother Sasuke instead. He stuck out his tongue. Don't want him training when I'm not. Kushina laughed. You go do that then, she said. Say hi to Mikoto for me, will you? Naruto nodded and jogged away, faintly humming a discordant tune. Kushina watched him go with a faint smile. Unbeknownst to him, just before he went out of sight her eyes narrowed. Her focus shifted to the left, and chakra began actively coursing through her body. At an invisible signal and in a moment so short it didn't really exist, the Hidden Leaf's greatest weapon was entirely prepared for a fight. And what, Kushina muttered under her breath as she silently began stalking forward, are you up to? ####. Sit down, Sasuke's mother said, and he did, plopping down on the ground and examining his work with a critical eye. All 8 of the posts on the other end of the throwing range were covered in a comical amount of shuriken. It had reached the point after nearly 2 hours of practice that he'd been aiming for the space in between the steel. He'd landed far more than he'd missed, but anxiety was still twisting Sasuke's gut into knots. It was a warm and sunny day, especially for January, but Sasuke couldn't feel the sun on his neck and arms. He felt cold and distant, even with his mother only a couple feet away. Not good enough, he muttered, and his mother narrowed her eyes. Better than anyone else your age, she said, her tone sharp, and Sasuke grunted. I never was able to get close to him, he said, tossing one of his last shuriken into the ground. Shuriken jutsu, ninjutsu, taijutsu. He gritted his teeth. Even now. You can't compare yourself to Itachi, Mikoto said. Sasuke looked up at her, she was completely expressionless. It's a fool's errand. You don't think I can catch him? Sasuke asked, his voice low, and his mother sighed. I don't think it's your responsibility, she said. It never has been. It's something you took on yourself, Sasuke. I allowed it because it helped you deal with what happened, but You allowed it. Sasuke snapped back. He's my brother, and your son. You should feel the same way I do. He shot to his feet, face twisting. Itachi is our responsibility. His mother watched him carefully, and Sasuke's anger faded and gave way to embarrassment. He shuffled his feet, glad the training ground they'd come to was empty. It had been like this since the forest, he thought. He felt like he didn't have any control of himself, and of his feelings. Itachi had broken his composure along with his arm, but the first couldn't be healed by any jutsu. I'm sorry, he said after a couple seconds, and his mother nodded, taking the apology with grace. He found himself looking at the scars on her face, feeling something curdle in his heart. But I can't. I don't understand him, and I can't let him get away. It's normal to seek answers, and revenge, his mother said with a frown. But you've been moving from that towards an obsession, Sasuke. I don't like seeing that in my son. What should I do then? Sasuke asked, starting to pace. Just let him get away? Forget him? He came back, just for me. He paused, and suppressed a sneer. For my eyes, probably. I'll never be able to ignore him, so long as he's alive. Of course not. His mother shook her head. Just, allow yourself some distance. Meaning? Sasuke narrowed his eyes. Your brother died that night, Mikoto said bluntly. Whoever killed your father and so many other Uchiha, that wasn't the Itachi anyone there knew. He'd been growing more distant for some time, but not towards anything that would indicate that. She closed her eyes, and for a moment Sasuke saw in his mother a fragility and fatigue that he'd never seen before. Never allowed himself to see, he wondered, or never been allowed to. Mikoto Uchiha had always been composed and disciplined, it could have been both, or neither. You're the only son I have, she said after a moment of thought. The man who's taken your brother's name is just an imposter. She held up a hand at Sasuke's questioning look. Not literally. I'm not crazy, obviously. But that's the distance I'm talking about. Her cold facade cracked again, just for a second. You've got to learn to separate the Itachi that was your brother, and the Itachi that broke your arm, Sasuke. If you don't, you'll never be able to accept reality. Sasuke wasn't sure if that would work for him, but it made sense to him that was what his mother must have done. What else could she do, with her prodigy son turning on his family so violently? They'd never talked about this in such detail before. To his mother, the Itachi that had loved them and the Itachi that had tried to kill them were totally separate people. But then, Sasuke thought, maybe they really were. If someone became another person who only looked and acted like their past self, was it really strange to say they were someone else entirely? Maybe not. Maybe that was the distance he needed to resolve the question that was always burning him down from the inside out. To just reject the premise. His brother was dead. His business was with his doppelganger. Okay, he said. They'd been standing in silence for almost a minute, his mother watching him with crossed arms. I'll think about that. Okay, his mother echoed him with a faint smile. It's hard, you know. I know. Her smile grew a little more genuine. But we can do it together. Sasuke rolled his eyes at that, and his mother laughed. That's the principle of the village. Teamwork is always superior to working alone. Sasuke frowned. If that's the case, he said, why is the final for the exam single elimination matches? His mother frowned back, and he continued. And why was I put up against Naruto? If that's the core of Konoha, that doesn't really make sense. He looked up at the sky, blue and bright. I didn't really think about it, with Sakura up against Gaara. That's a good question, Mikoto said with a nod. The final exam isn't really an expression of the village. It's a show, to put it bluntly. A show. The most powerful people from across the land of fire and beyond will be coming to watch, Mikoto said. That's why the matches are one-on-one, so that they'll be easy for non-shinobi to follow. Essentially, it's an exhibition. She mockingly strutted back and forth, throwing her voice slightly. Oh, look how powerful our young shinobi are, please hire them right away, she said, before laughing. A glorified interview. An interview? Haven't we already proven ourselves? Isn't that what the academy is? Sasuke asked, feeling some of his anxiety leach away, being replaced by curiosity. He rarely heard his mother speak like this. Yeah, to the village. But that's the dichotomy of being a ninja nowadays, Mikoto said. There's being a shinobi in the village, and there's the image you have to present outside of it. Some people have trouble reconciling that. She grinned. That's why you should have fun with your fight with Naruto. I know you both want to win, but you should be trying to make it as flashy as possible. The ninja there will already know you're worthy. You don't need to worry about impressing them. Naruto's probably hearing the same thing, Sasuke said, and his mother nodded. Without a doubt. And what about Sakura? He asked, and his mother grew more subdued. What's her interview then? Gaara of the desert already has a reputation, Mikoto said bluntly. If Sakura survives, she'll have succeeded. That's all she needs to do. That's cruel, yeah. Mikoto shrugged. But that's how it is. You've got some company, by the way. She gestured, and Sasuke looked back over his shoulder to find Naruto waving at him from across the field. Hey! His teammate called, and Sasuke grinned. Slacking already? He called, and Naruto scowled. Says you. He shot back, and Sasuke laughed. You're the one sitting around. Got tired of tossing stars so quickly. Sasuke glanced back at the hundreds of shuriken dotting the posts, and then looked back at Naruto with a flat expression. His friend cracked up after a moment. Fine. He admitted. You got me there. He started walking forward, and Sasuke went to meet him, leaving his mother behind. I got bored. I wanted to see how you guys were doing. I'm doing fine. Do you mean Sakura? Sasuke asked, and Naruto nodded. We haven't seen her in forever, he said, kicking at the ground. I wanna check on her. Sasuke looked back at his mother, and she grinned and made a shooing motion. Breaks are important, she said. Go check on your friend. She and Obito are at training ground 88, last I checked. Pretty close, as far as that went in the sprawling expanse of Konoha. Sasuke nodded, and Naruto waved. Mom says hi. He shouted as they jogged away. We'll see you later. Sasuke waved as well, but he wasn't thinking about later. He was thinking about what his mother had said about his dead brother, and Sakura. Cruelty is how it is, he thought, and he was a little surprised at the clarity and viciousness of the thought as he and Naruto left the field. ####. When her teammates found her, Sakura was doing the same thing she had done every day for over 8 hours straight for the last 2 weeks. Both of her hands were submerged in buckets of water on either side of her, and she was deep in something she had almost started thinking of as meditation, pulling the water out of the buckets and commanding it with her chakra. She had moved beyond pillars by the end of the first week. Obito and Asuma Sensei had told her to try more complicated shapes than stacks of water, and Sakura had followed their advice. It had been impossibly challenging at first to guide the water into anything more complicated than a split pillar, but time and practice had made it easier and easier. Now, she wasn't getting tired so fast, even if she sometimes had to close her eyes and center herself, to take stock of the tingling across her body as chakra poured out of her hands and left her hollow and light, like an empty glass. Now, she was making flowers instead of pillars. It was the same basic shape, projecting the water upwards, but the difference was at the top, where her chakra split the water out into wide petals. Keeping the water suspended in that shape in defiance of gravity was a gratifying challenge. Now, at the end of the second week, the flowers were becoming as simple to Sakura as the pillars had been. She'd have to move on soon, to keep challenging herself. Sakura! She yelped, the flowers collapsing back into the buckets at her sides as her hands instinctively clenched into fists, and opened her eyes. Naruto and Sasuke were standing in front of her, peering at her inquisitively. Naruto was practically glowing red. "Sorry," he said, and Sasuke chuckled. "We didn't mean to, that was really cool." "Naruto? Sasuke?" Sakura shook her head, trying to center herself. "Where'd you guys come from?" "We walked right up," Sasuke said matter-of-factly, and Sakura felt herself blush. She really had been so caught up in the exercise that she hadn't even heard them approach. "So you've moved on, huh?" He looked around as Sakura pulled herself off the ground, feeling a little woozy now that her concentration had been broken. "Where's Sensei?" "Huh?" That was the first time Sakura had heard him call Obito that. "He left," she said, fumbling for her sword, which she had laid out behind her. "To get some lunch for us." As she picked it up, she frowned. Asuma had taken the blade from her 2 days ago, and returned it the next. Ever since then the balance had been just slightly different. Not enough to be truly different, but enough for Sakura to notice. She hadn't bothered to ask what Asuma had needed her sword for, and he hadn't told her. If he was going to, he would when he needed to, she was sure. "He's not back already?" "He didn't use the Kamui?" Naruto asked, and Sakura laughed and shook her head. It was good to hear his voice, even though it hadn't been that long. "Asuma-sensei called him lazy for teleporting all the time," she said, and Naruto laughed too. "Said he should try running, like a real ninja." "Well, maybe he's right," Naruto joked. "I mean, I get it, if I could teleport everywhere dash. Like your dad," Sasuke suggested, and Naruto snapped his fingers. "Hey, yeah, he does the same thing," he said with a thoughtful look. "Do you think he taught Obito Sensei to use it like that, or the other way around?" "The first," Sasuke said, and Sakura secured her sword and walked up to her teammates. "My mother is always saying that your dad's the laziest Hokage we've ever had." "Huh?" Naruto crossed his arms. "That's just cause he gets so much done, there's nothing left to do after a while." "Sure," Sasuke said dryly. He looked to Sakura. "What do you think, Sakura? Lazy, or efficient?" Sakura didn't answer. She was too busy looking over his shoulder. Her mouth had gone dry. "Sakura?" Naruto asked. "What dash?" He looked back, following her gaze. Gaara of the desert was glowering at them from the shadow of a tree about 30 meters away, his hands rhythmically opening and closing, his chest heaving. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and focused directly on Naruto. "What?" Sakura thought, and even though Gaara couldn't possibly hear the thought, it was as though it triggered him to take action. His hands closed into fists, and he started slowly walking forward. "What? It's only the second week. I'm not ready. Why is he here?" It was a stupid thought, and Sakura recognized that immediately. Gaara obviously wasn't here for her. "Hey!" Naruto shouted, and Sakura's fugue broke. She drew her slightly too heavy sword, and Sasuke pulled a knife from his hip. They both jumped to Naruto's side, presenting a united front against the ninja from Suna. Gaara didn't care. He just kept stalking forward, eyes fixed on Naruto. "Get out of here, you freak!" Naruto shouted, and the boy flinched. "What the hell is wrong with you?" The words were harsh, but he sounded terrified. "You're very irritating," Gaara muttered, his pace never changing. His arms swayed from side to side, like he was sleepwalking, barely in control of his body. Sakura felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up, and her hands tightened around her sword. "I already told you how it is. It's your destiny for me to kill you." His eyes flicked between Sakura and Sasuke. "I'm not interested in your teammates. If they leave, I'll even let them live." "As if," Sasuke said, and Sakura nodded, raising her sword. Gaara didn't pause or even hesitate, like Sakura had quietly hoped he would. Instead, he smiled. "Fine, he said, only 15 meters away now. That might be more fun. She wasn't ready to fight. She wasn't ready for this fight. Would she ever be ready for this fight? Sakura felt one of her feet sliding back and steadied herself, trying to analyze the situation. What could she do against his sand with her sword? Nothing. None of them had anything that would work, even the raise non. Charging in would just get them cut or crushed. 13 meters. She started backing up, and Naruto and Sasuke followed her, keeping at her side. They had to stay out of Gaara's range. He hadn't struck yet, but he surely would soon. A tongue of sand crept up out of the gourd on Gaara's back, and for the third time in her life, Sakura accepted the possibility of her death. Stop. Sakura looked up, and something fast and red landed in front of her and her team, sending them stumbling back in shock. After a moment, they recognized the new arrival. Mom? Naruto asked, and Kushina Uzumaki didn't even look back at him. She was completely focused on Gaara. Sakura couldn't see her face, but for the first time the boy paused. More sand poured out of his gourd, tentatively floating around him. After 2 weeks of working with water, Sakura couldn't help but appreciate the insane level of control and power that must have been necessary to maintain the sand in the air like that. Could she do that with water particles? Maybe, but it would just form a mist. Would that even be useful? She was, as usual, overthinking things. Kushina took a step forward, and to her astonishment Sakura saw a golden light start to pulse in the small of the woman's back. What kind of jutsu was that? Turn around and walk away, right now. Kushina's voice was steel. You shouldn't be here. You aren't my mother, Gaara said, putting a peculiar stress on each word, and Kushina shook her head. Sakura caught a glimpse of her face. She was wearing a furious scowl. That thing isn't either, she said, and Gaara sneered. Liar, he growled, and more sand poured out of his gourd, so much that Sakura wasn't even sure it could hold it all. Liar, 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 liar. The sand spread out around him, pooling at his feet. Mother says I need to kill you too. He said it pensively, like someone had just whispered it in his ear. I guess I'll just kill all of you. Kushina grunted, and the light on her back exploded, resolving itself into 2 golden chains. As Sakura and her teammates watched, frozen with shock and awe, the chains darted forward, towards Gaara. The boy nodded, and his sand rose up in dozens of tendrils, walls, and other obstructions, trying to snare the chains. But Kushina's jutsu danced through everything, so quickly that Sakura could only see the golden after-image. Gaara's eyes grew wide as the chains drew closer, and he sent more sand after them, but Kushina's jutsu dodged everything, whipping to and fro like wild snakes. Unbelievable. Totally unbelievable. The jutsu was so fast and so flexible that Gaara's sand, which had stopped 2 teams at once, couldn't even touch it. Kushina twitched, and the chains surged forward. Sakura blinked, and they were through the sand, through a hole in Gaara's defenses. They rushed towards the boy's chest and head. Enough. The chains stopped before the voice had even cleared the training ground, and Gaara's sand rushed up, wrapping around them and trying to crush them. Kushina clenched a fist, and they evaporated in a rush of golden chakra, leaving Gaara clutching at nothing. There was a man under the same tree Gaara had been. He was tall, with tanned skin and dark red hair. Lord Kazekage, Kushina said, and Sakura was surprised the man didn't melt into a puddle of acid and bile from Kushina's tone alone. How good of you to join us. The glow in her back fully vanished, and Gaara growled, beginning to advance. Gaara, the Kazekage said, and his son stopped, eyes wide. I said enough. For a moment, it looked like the boy might tear himself in two, yearning to press forward but kept back by something like fear, if he could feel it at all. But it was only a moment, and Gaara relented, his sand sulkily sliding back into his gourd as he stood stock still, staring at Naruto and his mother. Tell me, Kushina said, were you planning to restrain him before or after he murdered my son? A shinobi cannot murder, or be murdered, Uzumaki, the Kazekage said with a faint sneer. But if you are so concerned, I would not have allowed this to proceed. How comforting, Kushina said, taking a deep breath. Naruto stepped forward. You're the Kazekage? You're his dad. He looked between the two of them, and Sakura did too. She could see a resemblance. Their faces were very similar, the same way Kushina and Naruto's were. What the fuck is wrong with you? He doesn't have much tact, does he? The Kazekage noted, and Kushina glanced down at her son. Sakura wondered how she'd ended up here, going from meditating with her water flowers to Naruto insulting the cage of an allied village in just minutes. I didn't hear anything out of line, she said, and the cage snorted. I'll forgive that, for today, he said, turning away. Gaara. Follow. It was like a command for a dog, not a human being, and Gaara resisted it for a moment. His father crossed his arms and tapped one finger against his shoulder, and something golden and shimmering rose up around him, like an aura of tiny particles. Now. Another time, Gaara eventually said, his eyes going dead and flat, and he turned to follow his father. Team 7 and Kushina watched him go the whole length of the training yard, and when they were finally at something resembling a safe distance the Kazekage turned. He wasn't looking at Naruto, or Kushina, or even Sasuke, but at Sakura. She blinked at the sudden attention. The man didn't look angry, or even irritated. He just regarded her with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. A word of advice, girl, he said, and Sakura felt herself bristle at the appellation. It doesn't matter how much you train. If you step foot in the arena with Gaara, he will kill you. He turned around, waving dismissively. If you want to live, you'll surrender. I can restrain him here, that won't be my duty during the exam. And with that, he and his son were gone in a flicker of sand and gold. Asshole, Kushina spat, turning around to face them. You guys all okay? Yeah. Sakura nodded, but found that her hands were shaking. She looked down at them, the Kazekage's words ringing in her ears. He will kill you. Was he following me? Naruto asked, and his mother nodded. How long? Why did you stop him? Sasuke asked, and Kushina frowned. For a while. Since Naruto left to find you guys, she said. I noticed right away, but I couldn't risk stopping him by myself, at least not until he got ready to attack. He's still a guest in the village, and the Kazekage's son besides, even if he doesn't treat him that way. Her lip curled in disgust. What a horrible man. Horrible men make horrible children, Sakura said faintly, and Kushina gave her a surprised look. My mother says that sometimes, she said, her head still ringing. He will kill you. He was talking shit, you know, Kushina said, and Sakura looked up in surprise at her coarse language. We won't let you die. The village won't let you die, not in a match against that guy. It's not happening. Sure, Sakura said. I know. But saying it out loud just made it more absurd. What could anyone do, even Kushina, or the Hokage, or her own parents, if Gaara caught her in his sand? What could they do if he started squeezing the life out of her, crushed her sword, crushed her bones? Nothing. If that happened, they wouldn't be able to do a damn thing. If you step foot in the arena with Gaara, he will kill you. Sakura shivered. Check the description for the links to the author.